It was just another evening at the Crimson Leaf, a high-end restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. The lights were dim, casting a warm, golden glow over the polished tables and the well-dressed patrons who dined there regularly. The hum of quiet conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware as soft jazz played in the background. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, something would shatter the illusion of perfection. Lillian James, an elderly woman with striking silver hair and a dignified presence, walked into the restaurant alone. She wore a simple but elegant dress, the kind that spoke of a life lived with grace. She had been to the Crimson Leaf before. The food was delicious, and the ambience was comforting. But tonight, she wasn't just seeking a meal. She was seeking a moment of peace, away from the loneliness of her small apartment and the weight of her thoughts. As Lillian approached the hostess stand, the young woman behind it glanced up, her smile freezing as she looked at Lillian's attire. Her eyes quickly scanned the restaurant, noting the other guests. Affluent, well-dressed, a perfect match for the restaurant's upscale image. Lillian's presence, despite her poise, didn't quite fit in. "Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked, her tone polite, but with a subtle edge of judgment. Lillian's brow furrowed slightly. "No, I didn't make one," she replied softly, her voice still warm, but tinged with an edge of uncertainty. "But I was hoping for a table for one. It doesn't have to be anything fancy." The hostess hesitated, her fingers tapping on the reservation list. "I'm afraid we're fully booked for the evening," she said, glancing over her shoulder at the sparse tables. "But I can direct you to a nice cafe down the street." Lillian felt a familiar pang in her chest. This was becoming all too common, the dismissiveness, the quiet exclusion. She didn't have the energy to argue. Before she could respond, a tall, sharply dressed man approached the hostess stand. It was Michael Hughes, the owner of the Crimson Leaf. His sharp suit and the air of authority that surrounded him made it clear he was a man accustomed to being in control. "Is there a problem here, Claire?" he asked, glancing between the hostess and Lillian. The hostess quickly explained the situation. Michael turned his gaze on Lillian, assessing her with a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her, and the seconds felt like minutes. Then, with a forced smile, he said, "I'm afraid we really are full tonight. Perhaps another time, ma'am?" His voice was smooth, but there was an undercurrent of impatience. Lillian's heart sank. She had faced moments like this before, being turned away, overlooked, dismissed. But something about this particular rejection stung more than usual. "I don't understand," she said softly. "It's not busy in here. I'm just looking for a simple meal. I can sit at the bar if you need the table." Michael's smile faltered, and he turned to Claire, giving her a subtle nod. The young hostess quickly stepped forward and gave Lillian a polite, but firm, pat on the back of her elbow. "Sorry, ma'am," Claire said, her tone now more insistent. "We just don't have space. You should try the cafe down the street." Lillian stood there for a moment, frozen. She didn't know what to say. The sting of the situation hit harder than she had expected. She had hoped for a moment of normalcy, for a place where she wouldn't be treated like an inconvenience. But it seemed that wasn't to be. As Lillian began to turn, feeling her shoulders slump, the atmosphere around her seemed to change. There was a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible ripple of tension that no one could quite place. The soft jazz continued to play. The clinking of glasses sounded as normal, but something felt off. Lillian didn't notice, but Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly at a nearby table, had watched the entire interaction. His gaze had been fixed on Lillian since she first walked in, and he hadn't missed a single moment. Keanu wasn't the type to make a scene. He didn't often draw attention to himself, but there was something about the way Lillian had been treated that struck him deeply. The casual cruelty of it, the disregard. He was a man who had experienced his share of public scrutiny, but he had never witnessed such a blatant, unspoken exclusion in such an elegant setting. Without thinking, he stood up. But before he could make a move, Michael Hughes's voice rang out, louder than necessary. "Claire," he said, his voice firm, almost too sharp. "Just let her go. We don't need people like her here." Keanu's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the back of the chair as he considered his options. No one else in the restaurant seemed to notice what had just happened. The world continued to spin, oblivious to the injustice that had just unfolded in the very place they thought was above reproach. Lillian, head held high despite the humiliation, walked out the door, disappearing into the cool night air. Keanu was left standing, his thoughts spinning. He hadn't planned on intervening, but what he had just witnessed, he couldn't shake it. As the door closed behind Lillian, the restaurant's world went back to normal. But Keanu couldn't help but wonder. What kind of world was this, where a simple woman like Lillian was so easily cast aside? And more importantly, would anyone notice? Lillian James wasn't the kind of woman who easily gave up. Life had tested her in ways most people couldn't imagine, but she had always found a way to keep going. She had raised her children with love and sacrifice, and after they had grown and moved away, she continued to teach, pouring her heart into her work as an elementary school teacher. Even now, in her late 70s, she found solace in books, music, and the occasional long walk through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. Her life hadn't been easy, but it had been hers. And for a long time, that had been enough. The apartment she had called home for the last decade was small, a simple one-bedroom with windows that looked out onto a busy street. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comfortable. She didn't need much. A cup of tea in the morning, a soft blanket at night, and the quiet hum of the city that she had grown accustomed to. She was content, though loneliness sometimes crept in, especially when her children, now adults with families of their own, visited less frequently. They were busy, living their own lives in other cities, with their own priorities. But Lillian understood. She had raised them to be independent, to carve their own paths in the world. She had wanted them to thrive, even if that meant they didn't need her as much anymore. She had her pride. After all, it wasn't easy, but she accepted it. That night at the restaurant, she hadn't planned on anything extraordinary. She simply wanted a quiet meal, a chance to escape the silence of her apartment. She had always enjoyed dining out from time to time, but it wasn't something she did often. It wasn't about luxury. It was about breaking the monotony of the days. She had heard so much about the Crimson Leaf from friends, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity. But as she stood outside the restaurant, feeling the cold bite of the night air, she couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. Why had they treated her like that? She had walked in with nothing but dignity, and yet, she was made to feel as though she didn't belong. Was it because of her age? Her skin color? Or was it something else entirely? The thought of it burned in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the sting of a world that was becoming harder and harder to understand. As she walked down the street, her steps slower now, she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the empty streets ahead. She was tempted to head back to her apartment, but something inside her refused. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the faint ember of hope that had remained in her heart, telling her to stand tall in the face of the disrespect. And that's when she saw it. Across the street, in the warm glow of another cafe, a familiar face caught her eye. A man was sitting by the window, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he was watching her, that felt different, intriguing, even. Lillian didn't recognize him at first. Her mind was still clouded with the injustice she had just faced, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized that it wasn't just any man. It was him, Keanu Reeves. The realization hit her like a wave. She hadn't expected to see anyone of note in a neighborhood like this, let alone someone so famous. Keanu wasn't someone she followed closely, but she knew who he was. His face was everywhere, plastered across movie posters and magazines. A familiar face, one that seemed out of place in this quiet corner of the city. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should she approach him? Or should she continue on her way? She wasn't the type to get starstruck, and the idea of bothering him seemed ridiculous. But Keanu, as if sensing her uncertainty, stood up from his seat and started walking towards her. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. What in the world could he possibly want with her? As he drew closer, Keanu smiled gently, his eyes soft and understanding. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and soothing. "I saw what happened back there. Are you okay?" Lillian blinked, taken aback. She had no idea how to respond. Here was this Hollywood star, someone most people would only dream of meeting, and he was asking if she was okay. It was almost surreal. I'm fine, she said, her voice hesitant. I just didn't expect to be treated like that. It was nothing, really. Keanu shook his head, his expression serious. It wasn't nothing. No one should be treated like that. Not anyone. Especially not someone with as much grace as you. Lillian blinked again, stunned by his words. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like that. People had always assumed she was just a little old lady, invisible to the world. But here was a man, a famous man, treating her like she mattered. She didn't know what to say. So, she simply nodded. Keanu continued, his voice quieter now. You know, I've been in the spotlight long enough to see how people can be treated unfairly, but it still never sits right with me. You don't deserve that. The warmth in his voice was almost too much to bear. Lillian's eyes started to sting, but she quickly blinked the tears away. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. You're very kind. Keanu smiled again, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to make the weight of the moment feel a little lighter. You deserve better, he said, then paused, his eyes scanning the street. Look, I don't know what's next for you, but if you ever need someone to talk to or just need a friend, you can find me. I'll be around. Lillian looked at him, her heart swelling. She didn't know what to say. Words felt too small in this moment, but the gratitude in her eyes spoke louder than anything. Keanu gave a small nod, then turned and walked back into the cafe, disappearing behind the glass door. Lillian stood there for a long while, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. A million thoughts raced through her mind, but one thing became clear. She wasn't alone. She wasn't invisible. And somehow, this unexpected encounter had reminded her of that. With newfound strength, she turned and made her way down the street, ready to face the world again, even if it meant standing up against the injustices that came her way. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Something more than just an evening of frustration and rejection. Something that would change everything. The next morning, Lillian awoke to the gentle light streaming through her apartment window. The streets outside were calm, a stillness hanging in the air before the hustle of the day began. For the first time in a long while, she felt different. She couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but there was something new, something awakened within her that she hadn't expected after the events of the previous evening. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping her tea and watching the steam swirl up from the cup, letting it settle her thoughts. The kindness of Keanu Reeves, a stranger she had only exchanged a few words with, had left a lasting impression. It wasn't just the fact that someone of his fame had noticed her. It was the way he saw her. Not as an invisible old woman, but as someone worthy of respect, someone whose presence mattered. His words had planted a seed of strength inside her that was slowly growing, pushing away the nagging feelings of doubt and shame. But it wasn't just that. There was also the realization that she wasn't alone in her struggle. Lillian thought back to the restaurant, to the way she had been treated by Michael Hughes and the hostess, Claire. She had been dismissed, yes, but more than that. She had been made to feel invisible. The way the world treated her, the way people seemed to look right through her, it had become more than just an occasional inconvenience. It was a reflection of a deeper problem in society, one that many had learned to ignore or accept. But now, something inside her was beginning to rise. A quiet defiance against the injustices that so often went unnoticed. It had been a simple exchange with Keanu, but somehow, it had changed everything. She wasn't sure how, or what it meant, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Later that morning, as she went about her usual routine of reading, organizing old letters, and tending to the small plants on her windowsill, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her daughter, Tasha, who had called just a few days ago to check in on her. "Mom, you won't believe this," the message read. "There's a video going viral about what happened at the restaurant last night. Some people caught it on camera. You know, the whole Keanu saves the day thing. It's everywhere." Lillian blinked at the message, her heart skipping a beat. Was it possible that her brief encounter with Keanu had been captured on video? The thought felt surreal. It was one thing to be in a restaurant, unnoticed, but it was something else entirely to be caught on camera with Keanu Reeves, the man who had unknowingly become a symbol of justice in her eyes. Tasha continued, "I don't know if you saw it, but everyone is talking about it. You should check it out." Lillian stared at the screen, uncertainty swirling inside her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the attention that would inevitably come with something like this. She wasn't a public figure. She wasn't looking for fame. But curiosity got the best of her, and she opened the video on her phone. The footage was grainy, clearly shot by a bystander, and it began with the moment Lillian had walked into the Crimson Leaf. The camera zoomed in on her face for a brief second, capturing the dignity in her eyes. Then, the video cut to the confrontation at the hostess stand, showing Lillian being turned away. The tone of the interaction was harsh, the rejection clear. But then, it took a turn. The video caught Keanu standing up, walking over to the hostess and speaking with her. His voice wasn't audible, but the movement was clear. The camera shifted focus to Lillian, who stood there, visibly affected, but still holding her ground. Keanu's gesture of kindness, his words of respect, were captured in the video as well. Lillian watched herself in the video, her heart heavy with the rawness of the moment. It was strange to see herself like this, vulnerable and exposed. But what struck her most was the way the video had been framed. The way Keanu had stepped in, his presence a stark contrast to the coldness of the restaurant's staff. And as the video continued, a message appeared on screen. Keanu Reeves, champion of decency. Lillian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She certainly never expected to become part of a viral moment, least of all one with such a grand headline. She quickly turned the phone off and sat back in her chair, a thousand thoughts racing through her mind. Was this really happening? How could such a small moment have such a huge impact? But the thing that lingered the most was not the viral attention, or even Keanu's kindness. It was something deeper, the realization that the world was watching. The world was paying attention to how people were treated, especially people like her, and that realization sparked something even more profound in her, a desire to make things right. As the day wore on, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change. The video had already spread like wildfire. Friends had called, strangers had sent messages of support, and Tasha was nearly bursting with excitement. But despite the flood of attention, Lillian knew this wasn't about her. It was about what this moment represented, the unfairness that so many people, especially older adults and people of color, faced every day without ever being noticed. Lillian wasn't going to be just a passive observer anymore. She had been wronged, yes, but she wasn't going to let that define her. If people were going to take notice of her now, it would be because she was going to use her voice, not just to speak out for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked. And as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her glasses and straightening her blouse, she made a silent vow to herself. This moment, however small, was going to start something bigger. The ripple effect had begun. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she was ready to find out. The following week felt like a whirlwind for Lillian. What had started as a small, fleeting interaction had exploded into something much bigger. The video had gained traction, spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone could have anticipated. What was originally a local story soon found its way onto news outlets, blogs, and even talk shows. Lillian's phone constantly buzzed with notifications, messages of support, questions for interviews, and requests for her to comment on the situation. She hadn't quite figured out how to handle all of this newfound attention. She wasn't a celebrity, after all. She was just a woman who had been treated unfairly and, by some strange twist of fate, had become the face of something much larger. But there was one thing she knew for sure. The attention wasn't about her. It was about the message. The treatment she had received at the Crimson Leaf was a reflection of something much deeper, something that needed to be addressed. Her first interview came in the form of a local news station reaching out. A friendly reporter, Maria, appeared at Lillian's door, microphone in hand, a camera crew standing quietly behind her. Maria's enthusiasm was genuine, but Lillian could see the underlying tension. She was reporting on something that, in the end, was far more significant than it appeared on the surface. "Mrs. James," Maria began, You've become a symbol for so many people who feel they are treated unfairly, whether it's because of their age, race, or just the way they're perceived. How do you feel about that? Lillian sat at her kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't sure how to articulate everything she was feeling. The story had already taken on a life of its own, and she wasn't sure where she fit in. But as she sat there, looking out the window to the street below, she realized something. This wasn't about her comfort. This was about something much larger than any one person. She hesitated, thinking for a moment, I feel like this is something that needs to be said. What happened to me at that restaurant isn't just about one person. It's about a pattern of exclusion that happens every day. To people like me, people who are overlooked and disregarded just because we're different or too old or not important enough. Maria nodded, her eyes focused on Lillian. You're absolutely right. And you've become the voice for so many who can't speak out. But, tell me, what do you hope comes from this moment? Lillian took a deep breath, her heart racing just a bit. I hope this opens people's eyes. Not just to the injustice I faced, but to the injustice others face. The kind of thing people don't see because they aren't paying attention. I want people to understand that we all deserve respect, dignity, no matter our age, no matter our background. Maria smiled softly, clearly moved by Lillian's words. I think you're already doing that. This video, your story, it's resonating with so many people. And it was. As the interview ended, Lillian felt a sense of purpose settle inside her. This wasn't just about standing up for herself anymore. This was about making sure no one else had to go through what she had endured. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she felt more ready than ever to fight for what was right. As days passed, Lillian received more and more calls. There were offers to join community events, speaking engagements, and even a few organizations reaching out to work with her on campaigns to combat ageism and racism in public spaces. It was overwhelming, to say the least, but Lillian couldn't ignore the tug at her heart. She knew this was her moment to make a real difference. The turning point came when Lillian was invited to attend a meeting at the local community center to discuss the impact of ageism in the workplace and public spaces. She had never been a public speaker, and the thought of addressing a crowd filled her with both excitement and trepidation. But as she stood in front of the group that evening, looking at the diverse faces of the people gathered in the room, she knew she couldn't turn back. Thank you all for being here tonight, Lillian began, her voice trembling slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. It's not easy to speak up when you've been treated unfairly, when you've been made to feel invisible. But we can't stay silent anymore. Her words were slow at first, but as she continued, a powerful energy filled the room. Lillian spoke of her experiences, not just at the Crimson Leaf, but of the countless small moments that had chipped away at her dignity over the years. She spoke of being overlooked in her youth and dismissed in her old age. She spoke of the ways people were judged based on how they looked or where they came from. The truth is, Lillian continued, we're all guilty of it. We've all judged others, sometimes without even realizing it. But I think it's time we all take a step back and ask ourselves, what are we really doing when we treat people like they don't matter? The room was silent as Lillian's words hung in the air. Then, one by one, people began to share their own experiences. Some spoke of being marginalized because of their race, others because of their gender or disability. As the stories poured in, Lillian realized something. This wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's fight. And together, they had the power to change things. In the days that followed, Lillian's life began to take on a new rhythm. She became involved in advocacy work, attending meetings, speaking at rallies, and writing articles about the importance of visibility and respect for all people, no matter their age, race, or background. Her story, which had once been a quiet moment of rejection, had turned into a movement, one that reached far beyond her. The ripple effect was real. People were paying attention, and while the challenges were great, so was the hope. And through it all, Keanu Reeves remained a quiet, unseen presence in her life. Though they hadn't spoken since that night at the restaurant, Lillian knew that his simple act of kindness had sparked a fire in her, one that couldn't be extinguished. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, dismissed, or less than. And as she stepped into this new chapter of her life, Lillian knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Lillian's newfound purpose started to gather momentum, but with it came a whole new set of challenges. As her story continued to make waves across media platforms, it was no longer just about her personal experience. The spotlight had shifted toward the larger issue of discrimination, ageism, racism, and classism that permeated not only the restaurant industry but many other spaces where people had become accustomed to excluding those they deemed other. But with that shift came something Lillian hadn't anticipated: opposition. Not everyone was as enthusiastic about change as she was. While the wave of support continued to build, there were pockets of resistance, mostly from people who felt threatened by the idea of questioning long-held norms. Some people simply didn't want to acknowledge the systemic nature of exclusion. Others, like the manager of the Crimson Leaf, were already gearing up to defend their actions. Lillian's phone rang early one morning, startling her out of her usual routine of sipping tea and reading the local paper. The number was unfamiliar, but something urged her to pick it up. "Mrs. James?" The voice on the other end was stern, yet polite. "This is Alan Reed. I'm the general manager of the Crimson Leaf. I'm sure you're aware of the media attention surrounding the incident last week. We're taking it very seriously." Lillian straightened in her chair, her stomach tightening. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. "Of course, I'm aware," she replied carefully, "and I'm glad to hear you're taking it seriously." There was a slight pause on the other end, and then Alan continued, "We've already started an internal review. We've spoken to both Michael and Claire, and they've provided their account of what happened. It's important for me to clarify that our intention was never to discriminate. This is simply a misunderstanding." Lillian's jaw tightened. She had heard the word misunderstanding far too many times when it came to situations like this. "Misunderstanding," she echoed. "If it was a misunderstanding, then why did I feel like I was being dismissed before I even stepped inside? Why was I told that I didn't belong?" Alan cleared his throat, sounding slightly uncomfortable. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. James, but we're reviewing the situation and will take appropriate action if necessary. We want to ensure this doesn't happen again." Lillian knew better than to expect a heartfelt apology or any sort of meaningful acknowledgement of the larger issue. But she wasn't going to let this conversation go unchallenged. "I appreciate that you're reviewing it," she said evenly, "but this isn't just about one incident. This is about a culture of exclusion. It's about the way people are made to feel invisible, the way ageism and racism are tolerated every day. You can't just apologize and call it a misunderstanding. This is deeper than that." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and Lillian thought he might hang up. But when Alan spoke again, there was a noticeable change in his tone. "I hear you, Mrs. James," he said slowly, "and I want to be clear that we're not defending what happened, but we also want to be part of the solution. If you're willing, I'd like to invite you to meet with me and some of our leadership team. Maybe we can find a way to work together on this. We'd like to make it right." Lillian felt a wave of surprise. Was this an attempt at damage control? Perhaps. But a part of her also recognized the sincerity in Alan's voice. He wasn't offering to just brush this under the rug. He was opening the door to a larger conversation. "I'll think about it," she replied, her voice steady. "But I need to be clear. I won't settle for just an apology. I want to see real change." "Understood. I'll reach out soon to schedule a meeting," Alan said, before the call ended. Lillian set the phone down and exhaled deeply. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. On one hand, she was grateful for the opportunity to have a direct conversation with someone from the Crimson Leaf. On the other hand, she knew it wouldn't be easy to have a meaningful discussion with people who were so entrenched in the status quo. But if she wanted to make a lasting change, she had to be willing to take these conversations head-on, even when they were uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves had become a quiet ally in this fight, though he wasn't always in the spotlight. After the viral video of their encounter at the restaurant, he had reached out to Lillian privately. He'd sent her a message on social media, simple and to the point. "I'm proud of your courage. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Lillian hadn't expected Keanu to reach out again, but his message had meant more than she could explain. It wasn't about the fame. It was about his quiet recognition of her strength, and she felt an unspoken connection with him. an understanding that this was more than just a personal issue. This was about shifting societal attitudes. Keanu's support wasn't public, but it was genuine. A few days after her phone conversation with Alan Reed, Keanu sent another message, asking if she had any upcoming events or speaking engagements. He wanted to help amplify her message in whatever way he could. At first, Lillian was hesitant. She didn't want to be seen as using Keanu for publicity, even though he wasn't pressuring her in the slightest. But after some thought, she realized that his involvement could help reach people who might otherwise ignore her message. His platform could give her the chance to speak to a wider audience and to shift the narrative. And so, after much deliberation, Lillian agreed to join Keanu at an upcoming rally on the steps of City Hall. The rally was being organized by a local coalition focused on dismantling ageism and racism in public spaces. It was an event that had been planned for months, but with Lillian's recent rise to prominence, the organizers had invited her to speak. She was nervous, of course, but standing alongside Keanu on that stage, as he took the microphone and introduced her to the crowd, Lillian felt a surge of courage. This wasn't just about the two of them standing there. It was about the countless people who were finally being seen, heard, and recognized. As she took the microphone, Lillian looked out over the sea of faces, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or unheard. "Thank you all for being here today," Lillian began, her voice steady. "This fight isn't just mine. It's ours. It's about standing up for every single person who has been made to feel less than. It's about creating a world where we don't have to fight for our dignity, where we don't have to prove that we matter." The crowd cheered, and Lillian smiled, feeling the warmth of their support. With Keanu by her side, she knew she was no longer alone. This was just the beginning, and the ripple effect? It was already growing. As the weeks passed, the momentum of Lillian's advocacy continued to build. The rally at City Hall had been a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for the community. Her speech, joined by Keanu Reeves' quiet yet powerful support, had turned into a beacon of hope for many who had silently struggled with similar injustices. But as the attention grew, so did the complexities of her newfound life. The phone calls never seemed to stop, and Lillian found herself juggling her quiet, reflective days with the demands of a public figure. She had been invited to give speeches at conferences, participate in town hall meetings, and even collaborate with nonprofits aimed at fighting discrimination. Still, amid all the excitement, Lillian felt a deep unease. She hadn't expected to be thrust into the spotlight so quickly. The public's attention was both flattering and overwhelming. While she appreciated the support, there was an ever-present pressure to represent an entire group of people, to be a voice for those who had suffered silently for far too long. And though she had a fire inside her, a need to speak up and make change, there were moments when she wondered if she could really live up to the expectations that were being placed on her. But there was one thing Lillian knew for certain. She couldn't stop now. The conversation had started, and she had to see it through. It wasn't long before she found herself back at the Crimson Leaf, in the very same restaurant where her story had begun. Alan Reed had invited her for a face-to-face meeting, eager to discuss what steps the restaurant was willing to take to address the discrimination issue. Lillian had hesitated at first. Was she ready to go back? To stand in that space where she had been so publicly humiliated? But in the end, she knew she had to. If the change was going to come from places like this, she couldn't be afraid to face it head-on. The restaurant was quieter than she remembered, almost eerily so. When she walked in, the hostess, Claire, was no longer at the front desk. Instead, Alan greeted her with a warm, yet slightly stiff smile. "Mrs. James, thank you for coming. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us today," he said, leading her to a small, private dining room. The air was thick with anticipation. They sat down at a table, and Alan immediately got to the point. "I want to apologize again for what happened. I realize words can only go so far, but I want to make it right. I've been talking with our team, and we're implementing new policies. We're going to do better, not just for you, but for everyone who comes through these doors." Lillian listened carefully, but her mind was already swirling with questions. Alan's words sounded sincere, but she had learned not to take apologies at face value. Words were easy, but actions were what truly mattered. What kind of policies? Lillian asked, her voice steady. How do you plan to change the culture here? You can't just put up a sign or say the right words. Real change takes more than that. Alan leaned forward, his hands clasped together. You're right, of course. We've started training for all of our staff, focusing on issues of racial and age-based bias. We're also working with outside consultants to help us build a more inclusive environment. And we're going to launch a community outreach program to make sure that we're reaching all members of our neighborhood, regardless of background. Lillian nodded slowly, processing the information. She didn't want to dismiss the effort outright, but she also didn't want to let the conversation become an empty exchange of promises. I appreciate the efforts you're making, she said, but how will you ensure that this doesn't just become a PR move? How will you hold yourselves accountable? Alan paused, clearly considering her words. We're going to create an oversight committee made up of employees and community members to monitor our progress. We'll also provide a space for customers to voice concerns, anonymously if necessary. Lillian felt a sense of cautious optimism. This wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The restaurant wasn't just sweeping the problem under the rug. They were trying to confront it head-on, albeit with a lot of work still ahead of them. I'm glad to hear that, Lillian said, her tone softening. But I hope you know that this is bigger than just this restaurant. It's about the broader issue of how people are treated, not just in dining establishments, but everywhere. Alan nodded in agreement. Absolutely. We know that, Mrs. James. We're committed to doing better, and we're committed to being a part of the solution. After a long pause, Lillian finally spoke again. I'll be honest, I still don't know if you can make this work. But if you do, if you truly make change, I'll be here to support it. But it has to be real. Alan's face softened, and he stood up, offering his hand to Lillian. We'll do our best, Mrs. James. Thank you for giving us this chance. Lillian took his hand, giving him a firm but respectful shake. We'll see what happens, she replied. As Lillian left the Crimson Leaf, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just walked through a door that had the potential to open much wider. The conversation with Alan had been a step in the right direction, but she knew the road ahead would be filled with both challenges and opportunities. It wasn't just about one restaurant. It wasn't even just about one person's story. It was about an entire system of exclusion that needed to be dismantled, piece by piece. In the days that followed, Lillian found herself grappling with a sense of uncertainty. Was she on the right path? Was she doing enough? She had become a symbol of change, but with that came an immense pressure to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward. Every action she took felt like a crossroads, a moment that could either lead to real change or fizzle out in the face of resistance. But deep down, Lillian knew this was the right fight. She wasn't doing it for fame. She wasn't doing it for accolades. She was doing it because, one evening, she had been treated unfairly. And that unfairness had rippled out, touching so many others, and now, she was determined to make sure that ripple reached its full potential. With every step she took, Lillian was shaping a new reality, one where people didn't have to prove their worth just to be seen. And that, she realized, was worth fighting for. The crossroads weren't so scary when you had a clear purpose, and Lillian was more certain than ever. This was the path she was meant to be on. Lillian had never expected her life to turn into such a whirlwind. What started as a simple plea for respect in a small, local restaurant had become a national conversation about ageism, racism, and exclusion. Every day seemed to bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new voices speaking out in support or opposition. But even amid the chaos, there was one constant: the feeling that something truly significant was happening. The ripple she had created was reaching further than she ever imagined. It wasn't just the media or the activists who were paying attention anymore. Everyday people, who had never considered themselves involved in such movements, were now reaching out to Lillian. They shared their own stories of discrimination, whether it was in their workplaces, families, or communities. It was a sobering reminder that, for every person who had suffered in silence, there were many more who had lived with the same injustices, and many of them were now ready to take a stand. But with all the support came a darker side. The trolls, the critics, the voices that had long been buried in the shadows. Lillian had read some of the comments online. They were brutal, accusatory, and often cruel. People called her just another entitled complainer, or claimed that she was trying to play the victim. Some said she was taking advantage of Keanu Reeves' kindness. The vitriol was overwhelming, and it was hard not to let it get to her. One night, after a particularly long day of meetings, Lillian sat alone at her kitchen table, scrolling through the messages on her phone. The negative comments weighed heavily on her. She had grown used to people's admiration and support, but these harsh criticisms cut deep. It was as though they were attacking not just her, but the very principles she was fighting for. Her thoughts were interrupted by a ping on her phone. It was a message from Keanu. "Hey Lillian, just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" Lillian smiled softly at the message. Keanu had been a quiet, yet constant source of support, someone who never pressured her or asked for anything in return. He had always made it clear that he was there for her, regardless of the public attention. She quickly typed a response. "Some days are easier than others. The support is amazing, but the negativity is hard to ignore. It makes me question if I'm doing the right thing." Seconds later, Keanu's reply appeared on her screen. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let the noise drown out the purpose behind it all. The people who matter will hear you, and they'll support you. Focus on that." Lillian felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. His words, as simple as they were, reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't for the approval of everyone. It wasn't for the likes or the shares or the comments. It was because of the people who had been silenced for too long. It was for the people who had been treated as invisible, just as she had once felt. With that renewed sense of clarity, Lillian knew what she had to do next. She had to take the fight to a larger stage. It wasn't long after that conversation with Keanu that Lillian was invited to speak at the National Voices for Change Summit, an annual event where people from all over the country gathered to discuss issues of inequality and social justice. This year, the theme was breaking the silence, and Lillian had been specifically requested to be one of the keynote speakers. The summit was taking place in a large conference hall in the heart of the city, with hundreds of attendees from across the nation. Lillian had never spoken in front of such a large crowd before, but she knew this was a pivotal moment. This was her chance to not only share her story but also give voice to all those who had been marginalized and unheard. As she stood backstage, waiting for her turn to take the stage, Lillian felt a rush of anxiety. She could hear the chatter of the crowd beyond the curtains, the hum of anticipation as people waited for the speakers to begin. She could feel her palms sweat, her heart race, but she knew she had come too far to back down now. When her name was called, she walked out into the spotlight, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd gave a polite round of applause, but Lillian could see their curiosity in their eyes. She wasn't just another speaker. She was the woman who had taken on an entire restaurant chain and stood up for the dignity of those overlooked. She was a symbol of something bigger than herself. Taking the microphone, she cleared her throat and addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," Lillian began, her voice steady. "I want to share something with you that I never thought I'd have to say. I'm here to speak for the invisible ones." The room went quiet, and she continued, "For so long, I felt invisible. I felt like I didn't matter. When I was dismissed at the Crimson Leaf, I thought it was just a one-time incident. But as I started to listen to the stories of others, I realized that what happened to me wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't a mistake. It was part of a pattern of exclusion." Lillian paused, taking a deep breath before going on. "But here's the truth. We don't have to be invisible. We don't have to accept being overlooked. We have the power to make change, but it starts with seeing each other, really seeing each other, recognizing the worth of every person, regardless of their age, race, gender, or background. We all deserve respect. We all deserve to be heard." Her voice shook with emotion, but she kept going. "I'm here because I believe we can change things. We can make the world a place where no one has to fight for their dignity. But that change requires all of us. It requires each of you to be the voice for someone who is silenced. It requires all of us to stand up and say, 'Enough.'" The crowd was silent, and then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, soft at first, and then growing into something more powerful. Lillian felt a surge of energy, the kind she had never experienced before. It was as if the weight of all her struggles, all the challenges she had faced, had been lifted by the support in the room. As she finished her speech, the applause thundered, and Lillian stepped down from the stage, her heart racing but her spirit soaring. She had just taken the next step in her journey. She had given a voice to the invisible, and in that moment, she realized something. This was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, but she was no longer alone. The ripple effect had grown, and now, it was becoming a wave of change that was impossible to ignore. Lillian had never been naive about the complexity of change. She knew that, as her visibility grew, so too would the forces of resistance. But nothing could have fully prepared her for the intensity of the backlash that followed her speech at the Voices for Change Summit. It started small, a few snide comments on social media, a couple of opinion pieces dismissing her as a media darling, trying to make a name for herself. But then it escalated. A segment on a popular conservative news channel had taken her speech out of context, portraying her as a troublemaker who was pushing a divisive agenda and playing the race and age card. Lillian had learned to ignore some of the more toxic remarks. But this felt different. The personal attacks were not just against her, but against the cause she had become the face of. They questioned her integrity, mocked her desire for change, and suggested that people like her were the real problem, stirring division where there had been none. Her phone rang one evening, and she answered it without thinking. The voice on the other end was familiar. "Lillian, it's Keanu," he said, his tone calm but laced with concern. "I've seen what's been happening. How are you holding up?" Lillian sighed, setting the phone on speaker while she paced around the living room. "It's getting harder, Keanu. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I didn't expect this. The constant barrage of negativity is exhausting. They're calling me everything from a fake activist to a professional victim." Keanu's voice was steady, unwavering. "Don't let them define you. These people don't understand your journey, and they don't get the bigger picture. What you're doing is important. Keep your focus on the change, not on the noise." "I try," Lillian replied, sitting down on the couch. "But it's like I'm fighting two battles. The one with the systems that created all of this, and the one with the people who don't even want to acknowledge that these systems exist." There was a brief pause before Keanu spoke again, his words carefully considered. "I know it's tough, but remember, for every person who tries to tear you down, there are countless others who are looking up to you. They see the change you're trying to bring, and they're with you. You're not alone in this." Lillian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "You're right. I can't let the critics win. I can't let them silence what I know needs to be said." Keanu's next words were simple but powerful. "Exactly. And if you ever need to talk, if you need support or just someone to listen, you know I'm here." "Thanks, Keanu," she said softly, feeling a sense of relief in his unwavering support. "I appreciate you more than you know." The conversation ended, and Lillian leaned back, letting the weight of it all sink in. She wasn't naive. She knew this would only get harder. But one thing had become clear to her. The moment she stepped into the spotlight, she wasn't just representing herself. She was representing every person who had felt excluded, overlooked, or dismissed. And she couldn't turn her back on them now. The following week, the backlash intensified when an influential restaurant critic published an op-ed criticizing Lillian's call for systemic change within the hospitality industry. The article claimed that the woke culture was forcing businesses to bend over backward, and that such movements would lead to a culture of victimhood. The critic argued that Lillian's efforts to challenge the industry's long-standing practices would result in forced apologies and empty gestures, and that real progress would only come from personal responsibility and merit. The op-ed quickly went viral, and soon, it seemed as if the entire internet had an opinion about Lillian's activism. She couldn't help but feel the sting of those words, especially since they came from someone who, in her eyes, should have understood the power of influence in shaping the public's perceptions. But now, Lillian was part of the very system she was trying to change, and the criticism felt personal. Later that evening, Lillian sat down at her kitchen table, scrolling through the flood of comments on the article. Some were supportive, but many echoed the sentiment of the critic, that Lillian was a symbol of an overly sensitive, politically correct world. People even claimed she was ruining the restaurant industry, which had always been about hard work and merit. Lillian let out a frustrated sigh and put her phone down. She knew she couldn't let it consume her, but the constant barrage was wearing her down. There were moments when she wondered if her fight was worth it, if the backlash meant she was fighting a losing battle. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Startled, Lillian rose to answer it, only to find a young woman standing on the other side. The woman was holding a small bouquet of flowers, and her expression was earnest. "Are you Lillian James?" she asked, her voice tentative. Lillian nodded, slightly confused. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" The woman smiled shyly. "I'm Emily. I just wanted to drop this off for you." She held out the flowers. "I read about your story, and I've been following everything you've been doing. You're really making a difference, and I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're fighting for." Lillian was taken aback, both by the unexpected gesture and the sincerity behind it. "Thank you," she said, touched by the gesture. "It really means a lot to me." Emily's eyes brightened, and she spoke with urgency. "I'm a waitress, and I've experienced a lot of the same things. The discrimination, the way people look at me because of my age. I just wanted you to know that I stand with you. You're giving people like me a voice." Lillian's heart swelled, and she reached out to take the flowers. "Thank you, Emily. You don't know how much this means." As the young woman turned to leave, she paused, looking over her shoulder. "Don't let the haters get to you. Keep fighting. We're all behind you." Lillian watched her go, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Despite the criticism, despite the harsh words from people who couldn't see the bigger picture, Lillian was reminded in that moment of why she had to keep going. There were people who understood. There were people who had her back. And more importantly, there were people who needed her to keep speaking out. She stepped back inside, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it had never been about choosing the easy road. It had always been about standing up for what was right, for the people who were still being silenced. And for the first time in a while, Lillian felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone. She never had been. Lillian stood in front of a crowd that seemed to stretch on endlessly, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the first time she was speaking in front of a group of people outside of the summit. This time, a local gathering in the community center where her story had begun. This was a more intimate event, organized by a group of local activists who had been rallying for fair treatment in businesses. The place was packed, but Lillian wasn't sure what to expect. Would the people here still believe in the change she was fighting for? Or had the backlash she had faced in the media made them doubt her? She glanced over at Keanu, sitting in the front row, his presence a comforting anchor. It had taken him some time to arrive in town, but when he had immediately called to tell her he was there to support her once again, just as he had when they first met. He smiled at her, giving her a quiet nod, a simple gesture that reminded her she wasn't alone. Lillian took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The room quieted immediately, eager to hear from the woman who had turned her personal experience into a movement. "Thank you all for being here today," Lillian began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I first began sharing my story, I didn't expect it to turn into something so far-reaching. But what I've come to realize is that this isn't just my story. It's the story of so many people who have been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated for reasons beyond their control." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and Lillian's nerves began to fade away. She felt the warmth of the room's energy, felt their shared understanding, and it gave her strength to continue. "You see, the fight isn't just about me getting a seat at a restaurant," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "It's about recognizing the ways that systems, whether it's in business, in society, or in our hearts, are built to favor some while pushing others down. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want to live in a world where that's the norm?" The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word, and Lillian could feel the gravity of the moment. This was why she had started. To bring the conversation into spaces like this one. To challenge the status quo. And most importantly, to show that a small act of resistance could ripple outward into something bigger than anyone had ever imagined. But just as she was gaining momentum, A voice from the back of the room cut through her thoughts. "You're just stirring up problems, you know?" It was an older man, standing near the back. "What about personal responsibility? The real problem is people trying to get something for nothing." Lillian's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't back down. This was the challenge she had expected. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't about entitlement. This is about equality. It's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, has the same opportunities and is treated with the same dignity. Personal responsibility can't exist in a world that already has built-in disadvantages for some." A few heads nodded in agreement, but the man wasn't done. He scoffed, shaking his head, and called out again. "So you think everyone should just get a free pass because they can't handle the world the way it is? That's nonsense." Lillian felt the familiar tension rising in her chest, but this time, she was ready. "It's not about free passes, it's about fairness. I'm not asking for anyone to be handed anything. I'm asking for the opportunity for everyone to walk in with the same chance, to be seen for their worth, not their age, their race, or their background." A hush fell over the room. The man didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Lillian had made her point, and she wasn't going to back down now. She looked out over the crowd once more, her eyes meeting those of the people who had supported her from the start. It was clear to her now that this moment wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about shifting minds, one conversation at a time. The rest of her speech flowed more easily, the passion and conviction in her words translating to the faces in the crowd. She shared her vision for the future, a world where every business, every person, every community operated with fairness and respect as the baseline. She spoke of the power of collective action, of standing up against the systems that had long held certain people back. As she finished, the applause in the room was overwhelming. People stood up, clapping, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Lillian felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, but she knew that the applause wasn't just for her. It was for the movement, for the change that was taking shape, slowly but surely. After the event, as Lillian mingled with the attendees, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Her story gave me the courage to speak up in my own workplace," one woman said. "I've been working in a restaurant for years, and I've seen the same discrimination she talked about. We need to change the way we treat people," a man added. Keanu, who had been quietly observing from the side, approached her with a grin. "I'd say that went well," he said with a wink. Lillian smiled, a little tired but feeling lighter. "I think so. But it's just the beginning, Keanu. There's so much more to do." "I know," he said, nodding. "But you're making an impact, Lillian. You've already changed so much." That night, as she sat in her hotel room, Lillian couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. When she had first stepped foot in the Crimson Leaf, she had been just another woman subjected to discrimination, a woman who felt small and unheard. Now, she was a catalyst for change, a voice in a larger conversation that was rippling through the country. But the journey wasn't over. The critics were still out there, and the challenges ahead were daunting. But Lillian knew that every step she took, no matter how difficult, was a step toward a world where people wouldn't have to fight for their dignity. She picked up her phone and sent a quick text to Keanu. "Thanks for being there today. It means more than you know." He responded almost immediately. "You're doing amazing work, Lillian. Keep going. I'm with you all the way." Lillian sat back, a sense of peace settling in. The path ahead was uncertain, and the challenges would continue to come. But with every step she took, she knew that the change she had set in motion was real. And she wasn't going to stop now. Not for anything. Not for anyone. She was in this for the long haul. The days after the community event passed in a blur. Lillian was busy managing media requests, meeting with other activists, and planning her next steps. The backlash had not completely dissipated, but it was starting to feel less oppressive. She had grown used to the snide comments, the criticism that followed her every move. What mattered more now was the wave of support that was steadily growing. Lillian was starting to realize that she could use her platform to bring together people who had once felt isolated. She wasn't the only one fighting for change. She was part of a much larger movement, and it was time to tap into that collective strength. But as her influence spread, so too did the attention from larger, more powerful entities. It was both exhilarating and intimidating. One evening, she received an unexpected call. It was from none other than Emily, the young woman who had shown up at her doorstep with flowers, expressing gratitude for Lillian's work. Emily was eager to get involved further, wanting to organize a new initiative to support workers who had been discriminated against in their own jobs. "Lillian, I've been talking to a few others, and we think it's time to take things further," Emily said over the phone, her voice buzzing with excitement. "We're planning a nationwide campaign, a movement that amplifies the voices of people in the service industry. We want to build a support network for them, give them the resources they need to fight back and stand up for themselves." Lillian listened carefully, her mind racing. She had thought about the next steps, but hearing Emily's enthusiasm sparked something new in her. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies. And this felt like the perfect opportunity to collaborate on something that would extend beyond her personal story. "That sounds incredible," Lillian said after a long pause, her voice filled with genuine excitement. "Let's do it. Let's make it happen. But we'll need to reach out to other people too, people with a platform, people who've been through this as well." Emily agreed, and within days, they had set up a meeting to start organizing their new campaign. They invited local workers, activists, and even some business owners who were interested in learning how they could improve the culture within their own establishments. It didn't take long for the ripple effect to turn into something more tangible. The campaign was officially named Stand Together, Voices for Equality in the Workplace, a name that captured the essence of the movement: solidarity, justice, and inclusion for everyone in the service industry. Lillian felt a renewed sense of purpose. This campaign wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had been told that their voices didn't matter, all the workers who had been ignored or mistreated by an industry built on their labor. The first major event of the Stand Together campaign took place in a modest conference room at a downtown hotel. The room was filled with workers who had experienced discrimination in some form: elderly workers, people of color, women, and others who had been on the receiving end of unequal treatment. It was a diverse group, all coming together for the same cause. And in that room, Lillian could feel the power of what they were about to create. "I want to thank you all for being here today," Lillian began, addressing the group. "Each of you has your own story, and each story is important. But together, our voices will be louder. Our collective action will be unstoppable. This movement is not about one person. It's about all of us. It's about ensuring that no worker ever has to experience what I did at the Crimson Leaf. It's about fighting for respect, for dignity, for fairness." Her words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. There was a palpable sense of unity in the room. These weren't just abstract concepts to the people gathered here. They had lived through it. They had been silenced and overlooked. But now, they were standing together, ready to push back. "Now," Lillian continued, "we need to talk strategy. We need to mobilize, reach out to others who need support, and work with businesses that are open to change. This isn't just about calling out the bad actors. It's also about recognizing and supporting those businesses that are doing it right." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you think there's a way to make employers see the benefit of change? Because it's hard to change people's minds when they're so stuck in their old ways." Lillian nodded thoughtfully. "It's not going to happen overnight, but we can show them the value of a more inclusive workplace. More diverse teams lead to better service, better morale, and better bottom lines. We're not just asking for change because it's the right thing to do. We're showing them that it's also the smart thing to do." The meeting continued, filled with brainstorming sessions, strategy talks, and even some disagreements. But by the end of the day, Lillian felt a powerful sense of hope. She had seen firsthand how people could come together when they shared a common goal. This was just the beginning, but already, she could feel the momentum building. As the campaign began to take off, Lillian's phone was flooded with messages, and her social media accounts were buzzing with support. The media that had once been critical of her now began to report on the work of Stand Together, highlighting the positive change it was bringing to communities and businesses. The backlash, while still present, was slowly losing its grip as the campaign gained steam. One afternoon, Lillian received an invitation to meet with a powerful ally, a woman named Laura, a former executive at a large restaurant chain who had been one of the few to publicly support Lillian after the Crimson Leaf incident. Laura had been following the Stand Together movement closely and wanted to meet in person to discuss how she could help. Lillian arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet and spotted Laura at a corner table, her presence commanding and poised. Laura had become an unexpected ally in the months since the media storm. She had seen firsthand the ways in which businesses could improve, and she now understood the importance of using her influence to encourage change. "Lillian," Laura greeted her warmly, rising to shake her hand. "I'm so glad we could finally meet." Lillian smiled, feeling both grateful and cautious. "Thank you for your support, Laura. It means a lot, especially given the amount of criticism I've received. I didn't expect people in your position to step up like this." Laura's eyes softened. "I understand, but what you're doing is important, and more business leaders need to hear it. I want to help you amplify this message. We need to shift the narrative, not just about fairness, but about why diversity and inclusion are good for business. We can't keep pretending like the old ways work anymore." Lillian felt a surge of hope at Laura's words. This was the kind of support she needed, support that wasn't just about standing in solidarity, but about actively making change within the systems that had perpetuated inequality. "Let's do it," Lillian said, her voice filled with conviction. "Let's change the way businesses think about inclusion. Let's make it a part of their DNA, not just a checkbox to tick." As she sat down to discuss the details of their collaboration, Lillian realized that her journey had come full circle. What had started as a simple act of resistance had blossomed into a nationwide movement with the potential to change not only the restaurant industry but the very fabric of the workplace. And with each new ally, each new voice joining the cause, Lillian knew that she was no longer fighting alone. The ripple had become a wave of change that was just getting started. As Stand Together continued to grow, so did the challenges. What had begun as a small initiative quickly blossomed into a nationwide movement. Lillian found herself juggling media appearances, campaign meetings, and outreach efforts. The pace was relentless, and although she felt a deep sense of purpose, she also felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. One of the hardest challenges she faced was balancing the trust of those who had supported her from the beginning and the corporate allies she had to convince to join the cause. People like Laura, who had the power to open doors within the business world, were critical to the campaign's success. But not everyone was convinced that the movement could lead to lasting change. Lillian was well aware that there were skeptics, even within her own network. There were those who questioned whether partnering with businesses would dilute the movement's core message. Why trust the very institutions we're fighting against? They asked. How can we change the system from within when the system is the problem? And it wasn't just the activists who had doubts. Some of the businesses Lillian and Laura had approached for support were hesitant. They had become accustomed to the status quo, and many were wary of the financial and public relations risks involved in aligning with a movement that was still seen by some as controversial. But for every skeptic, Lillian found another who believed in the cause, and more importantly, in her ability to bring about change. It was during one of these difficult weeks, when everything seemed to be at a crossroads, that she received a call that would shift the entire direction of the campaign. It was Keanu. "Lillian," he said, his voice low but steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what you're doing. I know this isn't easy, and I know it feels like there's a lot of people who just don't get it. But you need to know, the people who support you are seeing the bigger picture." Lillian had been feeling overwhelmed that day, as if the weight of the movement had begun to crush her. The criticism had only intensified, especially from some of the more established figures in the industry. There were days when she felt like giving up, but Keanu's words always seemed to find her when she needed them the most. "I know," she replied quietly, "but it's hard. Every time I think we're making progress, something else happens. I have people questioning me, questioning us, and the companies we've been working with. Some of them just seem so disingenuous. I don't know if I can trust them." There was a long pause before Keanu spoke again. "That's because trust is earned, Lillian. You can't expect people to change overnight, but you've got something real, something they can't ignore. And that's where you need to focus, on what you can control, not on the rest of it." She leaned back in her chair, trying to absorb his words. Trust. It was always a two-way street, wasn't it? She couldn't expect the businesses she was working with to jump in fully without seeing real commitment on both sides. She couldn't force them to change, but she could hold them accountable and ensure that the movement never lost its purpose. "I just don't want to sell out," Lillian admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't want this to become just another marketing gimmick." "I get it," Keanu said, his voice warm with understanding, "but you have the power to steer this. If you keep your vision clear and hold people accountable, you won't lose your way. This is your movement. You're setting the terms." Lillian sighed, feeling a little lighter after the conversation. "Thanks, Keanu. You always know how to remind me why I'm doing this." "Anytime," he replied, and Lillian could almost hear the smile in his voice. "Just keep your head up. You're doing great." Over the next few weeks, Lillian focused on reaffirming her relationships with her allies and supporters. She spent time with grassroots activists, listening to their concerns and ideas. She made sure the voices of workers, particularly those who had faced discrimination firsthand, remained at the forefront of the campaign. But it wasn't just about external support. It was about the internal integrity of the movement. She realized that in order to truly make change, she had to stay true to her original vision. Fair treatment for everyone, no matter their race, age, or background. She had to hold herself, her partners, and the corporations accountable. She wouldn't compromise on that. Soon, the Stand Together campaign began to gain the kind of traction that even Lillian hadn't anticipated. Business leaders, aware that public opinion was shifting, started reaching out to her directly. They wanted to be part of the movement, but on their terms. They wanted to do things their way, without fully embracing the core principles of the campaign. Lillian refused to be swayed. She had learned over the past few months that the campaign could not, and would not, be about appeasing the powerful. It had to be about making real, lasting changes that would benefit everyone. She started meeting with businesses that were already on board with the cause, helping them implement policies that reflected the values of inclusion and equality. She worked closely with Laura, who had proven herself to be an invaluable ally, to develop a set of standards for businesses who wanted to be part of the campaign. The standards included mandatory anti-discrimination training, fair wages, accessible benefits, and transparency in how employees were treated, especially in the hospitality industry. But Lillian's focus was also on the culture within these businesses. She didn't just want companies to tick boxes. She wanted them to truly embrace diversity and make it a part of their identity. It wasn't long before the first wave of success began to show itself. A few larger restaurant chains that had initially been resistant to change, began adopting the Stand Together standards. They implemented anti-bias training programs and made strides toward improving their hiring practices. Some even began offering benefits like paid sick leave and flexible working hours for their employees. It was a victory, but Lillian knew there was still a long road ahead. One evening, she stood in front of a large crowd of activists, workers, and business owners who had gathered to celebrate the success of the first wave of businesses that had signed on to the campaign. The air was electric, charged with the energy of people who were witnessing a shift happen before their very eyes. Lillian stepped up to the microphone, her heart racing as the room fell silent. "We've made some progress, but this is just the beginning," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "There are still so many businesses that need to change, so many people who are still being left behind. But we've proven something important today. We've proven that change is possible. And we've proven that when we stand together, we are unstoppable." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lillian felt a deep sense of pride. But as she looked out over the sea of faces, she also felt a responsibility. A responsibility to keep pushing forward, to never lose sight of the people who were counting on her. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was just the beginning. With each passing day, Stand Together was beginning to take root across the country. Lillian was no longer just an activist. She had become the face of a movement. Her life had shifted in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first walked out of the Crimson Leaf all those months ago. What started as a personal battle had grown into something much larger, a wave of change that was challenging the very foundations of the industries that once kept their workers silent. But with the success came increasing pressure. Every move she made was scrutinized, every partnership dissected. The larger the movement grew, the more enemies it seemed to attract. And now, as things began to get real, Lillian was facing a new challenge. one that hit closer to home: a corporate backlash. As the movement continued to gain momentum, one of the most powerful restaurant chains in the country, a name that had been conspicuously absent from the list of businesses adopting the Stand Together standards, released a public statement. The chain had a history of mistreating its employees, including multiple reports of wage theft and workplace harassment. Yet, the company had avoided scrutiny for years, operating under the radar thanks to its wealth and influence. Lillian read the statement, her jaw tightening. The company was accusing Stand Together of advocating for unreasonable demands and claimed that its policies were unrealistic for the restaurant industry to implement at scale. It was a direct shot at the movement, designed to undermine everything she and her allies had worked so hard to build. The statement sent ripples through the business world. For many in the restaurant industry, it gave them permission to continue operating the way they always had, to continue exploiting workers and ignoring the calls for reform. Lillian knew this was going to be a turning point. How she responded would either solidify Stand Together as a force to be reckoned with or fracture the progress they had made. She gathered her team to discuss how to proceed. Sitting in the small conference room with Laura, Emily, and a few key supporters, Lillian's mind raced. It was clear that a response was necessary, but how to make it count? How could they turn this moment into another opportunity for growth, rather than letting the powerful corporation use it as a wedge to weaken their cause? "I know we're all upset by this," Lillian said, looking around the room at the anxious faces of her closest allies. "But we need to focus. This is our chance to prove just how serious we are. This isn't just about fighting one corporation. It's about showing the world what Stand Together stands for." Laura, who had remained calm throughout the meeting, nodded. "We have to respond publicly. We can't let them dictate the narrative. We need to double down on our message, that the restaurant industry can change, that workers can be treated with respect, and that these demands are not unreasonable. They're just basic human rights." Emily added, her voice unwavering. "We need to show the other businesses that this is a turning point. If they stand with us, they'll gain the trust of customers who want to see positive change. If they don't, they risk losing everything." Lillian stood up, pacing the room. "This could get ugly. We're up against an entire industry that's spent decades getting away with this. But I know what we're doing is right. And I know we have the power to win." Her resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let the statement from the corporation dictate the future of the movement. They would fight back, not just with words, but with actions that would demonstrate Stand Together's power. The plan was set into motion immediately. Lillian went public with a statement of her own, a direct response to the company's accusations. She used her platform, social media, interviews, op-eds, to spread the message that Stand Together was about fairness, not unrealistic demands. She reminded the public that workers were the backbone of the restaurant industry and that they deserved basic protections, like fair pay, respect, and the right to feel safe in their workplaces. But she didn't stop there. Lillian knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to mobilize quickly, to show the world that Stand Together was more than just talk. It was a movement of action. The response came swiftly. Workers across the country began sharing their stories, their experiences of mistreatment, the challenges they had faced, and the ways in which they had been exploited. Lillian's team launched a series of social media campaigns, using the hashtag #NotUnreasonable, which quickly began trending. The stories of workers, of people who had been pushed to their breaking points, were amplified by the movement's growing support base. It wasn't just activists and employees who were speaking out. Customers, too, began demanding more from the restaurants they frequented. They wanted transparency. They wanted companies to prove they cared about their employees and were willing to make the changes that were necessary. And they were ready to stop supporting those who didn't. Meanwhile, the corporation that had attacked Stand Together began to feel the heat. The backlash was swift. Boycotts began. Social media users flooded their accounts with messages of condemnation. News outlets began reporting on the growing support for Stand Together and the increasing number of businesses that had signed on to the movement standards. The company's reputation, once untouchable, began to crack under the pressure. Lillian watched the situation unfold, knowing that this was the moment of truth. She could feel the movement gaining strength, but she also knew there were still powerful forces working against them. There was no guarantee that the outcome would be as victorious as she hoped. It was late one night when she received an unexpected message. It was from Keanu. "I'm proud of you, Lillian," the message read. "You've shown the world what it means to stand up for what's right. Keep pushing. You're not alone in this." Lillian's eyes welled with tears as she read his words. She had come so far since that day in the restaurant when she had felt so helpless. But now, she wasn't alone anymore. She had a movement, a team, and a cause that was bigger than any single person. And, most importantly, she had the resolve to see it through. The next day, Lillian stood on stage at a rally, surrounded by workers, activists, and allies. The air was electric with energy, a feeling of triumph mixed with the knowledge that this was just one battle in a much longer war. "This is just the beginning," she said into the microphone, her voice ringing out across the crowd. "The fight for fairness doesn't end with one victory. It's ongoing. And together, we will keep pushing until every worker is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long while, Lillian allowed herself a moment of peace. She had fought, and she had won. But there was still much work to be done. The fight for change wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Lillian had the courage and the conviction to keep going, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And with each new voice joining the cause, she knew that nothing could stop them now. The dust from the corporate backlash had started to settle, but it left behind a trail of unresolved questions and lingering tensions. Lillian knew that while the victory over the powerful restaurant chain was a critical moment, it was not enough. The momentum had to be sustained. There were still many corporations that refused to budge, and countless workers who remained stuck in systems that perpetuated inequality and mistreatment. But she also knew that she was no longer fighting alone. The movement was growing. More companies were signing on to the Stand Together initiative, and the workers who once felt voiceless were now emboldened to speak out. Change, it seemed, was finally beginning to take root, though the road ahead remained long and uncertain. The next challenge came sooner than Lillian expected. She had just finished a meeting with a new group of investors who were interested in supporting the movement when she received a call from Laura. Her tone was urgent. "Lillian, you need to see this." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. Laura had never called her like this before, with such intensity. "What happened?" she asked, already bracing herself for bad news. "It's about the Rising Star restaurant chain," Laura said. "They're planning to launch a campaign that directly targets Stand Together, and they're using some very powerful people to do it." Lillian's stomach tightened. Rising Star was one of the largest restaurant chains in the country, with thousands of locations. They were well known for their high-end image and their marketing campaigns that emphasized community and employee satisfaction. But behind the glossy advertisements was a darker truth. Workers had long complained about low wages, grueling hours, and unfair treatment. Yet, the company had continued to maintain a facade of benevolence. Lillian knew that this could be a major obstacle. If Rising Star successfully managed to turn public opinion against the movement, it could set Stand Together back months, or even years. "What's their plan?" Lillian asked, her mind already racing. "They're launching a PR blitz that paints Stand Together as a radical organization out of touch with the realities of the restaurant industry," Laura explained. "They'll claim that our standards are unrealistic and will put restaurants out of business. They've even got endorsements from some major figures in the business world, people who are already trying to discredit your movement." Lillian's frustration flared, but she knew that anger wouldn't help her now. She had faced backlash before, and she could handle it again. What mattered was how they responded, not just to Rising Star, but to the larger issue they were all confronting. A system that was rigged against workers, and a powerful industry that would do whatever it took to preserve the status quo. "We need to act fast," Lillian said, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. "Get our team together. I want to craft a message that turns this around. We need to show that Rising Star is not only out of touch, they're protecting a system that exploits workers for profit." After ending the call with Laura, Lillian gathered her team. This time, it was an emergency meeting. She needed every one of them to contribute ideas on how they could take control of the narrative before Rising Star did. For hours, they brainstormed. They knew this fight was about more than just one corporation. It was about sending a message to the entire industry that workers deserved better, and that standing up for workers wasn't a radical act. It was the right thing to do. Lillian decided they needed to launch an immediate counter-campaign. But instead of just addressing the attacks head-on, they would focus on highlighting the real stories of workers who had been hurt by the very system Rising Star and others were trying to defend. She picked up the phone and called Keanu. She had to talk to him. His voice, his presence, had been a constant source of strength for her. And this time, it felt like she needed it more than ever. "Keanu," she said after he picked up, "I don't know what's coming next, but I need your help. Rising Star is going after us. They're trying to turn the tide against everything we've worked for." There was a long pause before Keanu spoke. "I know you're going to handle it," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet conviction that Lillian needed to hear. "But you're right. This is bigger than just Rising Star. It's about exposing the truth. People need to know what's really going on behind those shiny restaurant doors." Lillian nodded, feeling a sense of solidarity. "Exactly. And I think you might be able to help with that. Your platform, your voice, it could really amplify what we're trying to do. We need to give the people who've been silenced a voice. We need to make sure the public sees Rising Star for what it is." Keanu's response was immediate. "Let me talk to some people. I'll use whatever I can to get the message out. This fight isn't just yours. It's everyone's." Lillian smiled, relieved to know she had someone she could count on. "Thank you, Keanu. Really." The next few days were a whirlwind. Lillian's team worked tirelessly to craft a new narrative, one that flipped the corporate rhetoric on its head. Instead of portraying Stand Together as unreasonable or extremist, they would show how the movement was rooted in the experiences of real people, the workers whose lives had been changed by the campaign. Through powerful videos and social media posts, they featured personal testimonies from restaurant employees, people who had suffered under Rising Star's policies, workers who had endured long shifts with little pay, employees who had been denied promotions because of their race, people who had been fired for standing up for their rights. These stories, told directly by the workers, became the backbone of the campaign. Keanu's involvement took it to the next level. His endorsement of the movement, paired with a heartfelt message about why he supported Stand Together, helped propel the campaign to the front page of every major media outlet. The power of celebrity combined with the authenticity of the workers' voices had a ripple effect. It garnered national attention and, for the first time, it forced Rising Star to reckon with the truth. The corporation was caught off guard. They had underestimated the power of the grassroots movement and the strength of the workers' voices. Faced with mounting pressure, Rising Star was forced to respond, not with their usual PR tactics, but with an admission that some of their practices needed to change. It wasn't a full concession, but it was a step in the right direction. Lillian watched it unfold, her heart swelling with pride. This was the moment she had been working toward. It wasn't just about the victory over Rising Star. It was about something far bigger, proving that change was possible, that when people stood together, they could challenge even the most powerful corporations. And as she looked at the messages pouring in from all over the country, messages of support, solidarity, and hope, she knew that the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a moment to savor the sweet taste of progress. It was only a glimmer, but it was enough to keep her going. The victories were mounting, but so were the challenges. Lillian knew they had made significant strides with the Rising Star campaign, but she also knew the battle for workers' rights was far from over. Each success came with its own set of complexities, and while the movement was gaining ground, there were powerful forces still working to keep the status quo intact. The message from Rising Star had been loud and clear. The system was entrenched, and they weren't going to let go easily. But Lillian had learned one key lesson from all of this. Once you start a movement, it can't be stopped, no matter how hard the opposition tries to shut it down. Stand Together was becoming more than a reaction to corporate greed. It was becoming a force that demanded to be reckoned with. Lillian sat at her desk late one night, staring at the computer screen. The latest headlines were filled with stories of workers organizing in different parts of the country, and for the first time, businesses were being forced to respond. Some tried to get ahead of the wave of change by adopting more progressive policies. Others were still clinging to the old ways, hoping to weather the storm. But something else was happening too. More voices were joining the conversation, voices that had once been marginalized. The online forums, the social media groups, even the protests, they were all full of new faces. More workers were sharing their stories, and more allies were stepping forward, from activists to celebrities, even ordinary customers who were fed up with the lack of accountability in the restaurant industry. One of the most powerful developments had been the formation of worker solidarity groups. These groups were popping up in cities across the country, organizing locally to address issues that were being ignored by large corporations. They were no longer waiting for permission to speak out. Instead, they were taking matters into their own hands. Lillian's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked at the screen, seeing a message from Emily. "Lillian, you need to see this," it read. She clicked on the link Emily had sent. It was a video from a worker at a rising star restaurant, someone she had never met before. The worker, a young woman named Teresa, stood in front of the restaurant with a sign that read, "I refuse to work under conditions that dehumanize me. #Stand together." Lillian felt a lump in her throat as she watched the video. Teresa's face was raw with emotion, and her words rang out with the kind of conviction Lillian had only seen in the movement's most dedicated advocates. She was speaking directly to the camera, and her message was clear. Rising Star's treatment of workers was no longer acceptable, and the time for change was now. The video quickly went viral, with thousands of people sharing it. It wasn't just about one worker speaking out. It was a symbol of the collective strength that Stand Together had fostered. Teresa's bravery sparked a wave of similar videos from workers across the country, each sharing their own stories of exploitation and mistreatment. For every video, there were countless messages of support from people who were tired of the way things had been. Lillian immediately reached out to Emily. "We need to amplify this. Now." Within hours, the team launched a social media campaign that would turn Teresa's video into a national conversation. The hashtag We Stand With Teresa began trending, and the momentum was undeniable. Lillian knew this was the tipping point they had been waiting for. The movement had officially reached a new level. As the days passed, the response from Rising Star was exactly what Lillian had anticipated: silence. They had hoped to ride out the storm, to ignore the growing swell of support for workers. But their strategy was no longer working. People weren't buying into the corporate rhetoric anymore. They wanted action, not excuses. Lillian and her team didn't stop there. They organized rallies, protests, and town halls, bringing workers, allies, and even customers into the conversation. They used these gatherings to put real faces to the issues, to show the world that behind every story of exploitation, there was a person who deserved dignity, respect, and fair treatment. Keanu, as always, was by her side. His presence at rallies and in interviews brought an undeniable weight to the cause. But what was most powerful was the way he used his platform to give a voice to the workers. His posts on social media shared personal stories, messages of support, and calls for action that resonated with his millions of followers. He wasn't just a celebrity standing in solidarity. He was an active participant in the fight for change. For Lillian, it was becoming clear that the movement had reached a critical mass. The pressure on corporations was intensifying, and more businesses were starting to feel the heat. While not all of them were immediately ready to adopt Stand Together standards, many were now engaging in discussions about what they could do to improve conditions for their employees. But even with all the progress, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The system was vast, and the challenges were still great. The corporations were powerful, and they were not going to give up their grip on the industry without a fight. One morning, as Lillian sat in her office catching up on the latest updates, she received an unexpected call. It was from her lawyer, Mike. "Lillian, I think you should sit down," Mike said. His voice was grim. "What's going on?" Lillian asked, her pulse quickening. "It's about a lawsuit. Rising Star is suing Stand Together for defamation." Lillian's blood ran cold. A lawsuit? Defamation? It was clear that they were trying to discredit the movement, to use legal power to silence them. But Lillian wasn't going to back down. She had come too far to be intimidated by threats like this. "I won't let them stop us," she said, her voice resolute. Mike hesitated. "We'll need a strong legal defense. They're going after your reputation, and this could get ugly. But we can fight this." "I know we can." Lillian took a deep breath. She knew the road ahead was going to be hard. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had the movement, she had her team, and she had the countless workers who were counting on her. As she sat back in her chair, Lillian looked at the photo on her desk. It was a picture of the rally in support of Teresa, the workers standing together, their fists raised in solidarity. That image, their faces, their courage, was the reason she had to keep going. No lawsuit, no corporate threat, no amount of opposition could take that away. She had sparked something, and that something was not going out without a fight. This battle was far from over, but Lillian knew one thing for sure. They were making history, one stand at a time. The lawsuit from Rising Star was only the beginning of a new, more intense phase in the battle for workers' rights. Lillian knew that this would be the defining moment for Stand Together. The stakes had never been higher. It was no longer just about changing policies within restaurants. It was about preserving the integrity of the movement itself. Despite the legal threat hanging over her, Lillian was resolute. Her team worked around the clock with the best legal minds they could find, putting together a defense that would not just protect the movement's reputation, but turn the tables on Rising Star and their attempts to suppress the truth. The media, as expected, latched onto the story. Headlines were dominated by the dramatic clash between the grassroots movement and the corporate behemoth, but the narrative had already shifted. The public was no longer buying into the corporation's polished image. They were starting to see them for what they were, a symbol of the very system that had been exploiting workers for decades. Lillian knew that this was her moment. They needed to stay visible, stay vocal, and keep the focus on the workers. They couldn't afford to be distracted by the legal battle, no matter how daunting it seemed. Late one evening, just after finishing a strategy session, Lillian sat alone in her office. The weight of everything, the movement, the lawsuit, the pressure, was starting to wear on her. She could feel the exhaustion creeping in, even though she had trained herself to ignore it. But just as the thoughts of doubt began to creep in, there was a knock on the door. It was Emily. "I've got something you need to see," Emily said, holding up her phone. "I think this could change everything." Lillian followed Emily to the small conference room, where they both sat and watched the screen. Emily clicked play, and Lillian's heart raced as a familiar face appeared on the screen. It was Teresa, the worker who had started the viral hashtag We Stand With Teresa campaign. But this time, Teresa wasn't alone. She was standing with dozens of other workers, some from Rising Star, others from different restaurants. All of them had their faces covered with bandanas or masks, holding signs that read, hashtag Workers Unite, and We Deserve Better. The video was a declaration. "We are more than just employees," Teresa began, her voice clear and unwavering. "We are people, and we will no longer be silenced by corporations who care more about their profits than our lives. This is about dignity, respect, and a fair chance for every worker in this industry. The fight is not just for me, it's for all of us." Hashtag Stand Together. Lillian felt a lump in her throat. The movement had taken on a life of its own, far beyond what she had ever imagined. It was no longer just about her. It was about something much bigger. A collective fight for justice, for workers, for a future where they were no longer treated as disposable. Emily smiled, clearly proud of what they had just witnessed. "It's happening, Lillian. The workers are taking ownership. This is bigger than us now." Lillian nodded, her mind racing. She knew that this video, this moment, could be the tipping point. It had the power to unite workers in a way nothing else could, and it could pressure Rising Star into rethinking their strategy. "Let's make this go viral," Lillian said, her voice firm. "We need to put this everywhere. We need to let the world know what Rising Star is trying to hide." Within hours, the video was shared across every platform imaginable. Social media exploded with support, and the hashtag Workers Unite took off. News outlets picked up the story, and once again, Rising Star was forced to confront the truth. Their response was slow, but predictable. They issued a generic statement claiming that they were committed to improving their workers' conditions, a statement that rang hollow after months of ignoring the workers' demands. But Lillian and her team weren't done yet. They knew that the real work was in mobilizing the public, in ensuring that this wasn't just another viral moment that would fade with time. They needed action, and they needed it now. They organized rallies in major cities across the country. Lillian spoke at each one, but this time, she wasn't alone. Workers from every part of the industry, from servers to kitchen staff to managers, stood by her side, sharing their stories, demanding change. The crowds were massive, their energy infectious. It was clear. The movement had gained real traction. Keanu was there too, showing up at rallies, lending his voice to the cause. His presence was powerful, but more than that, he was using his influence to keep the spotlight on the workers and their stories. It was no longer about him. It was about all of them. And then came the unexpected, a letter. It was from the CEO of Rising Star. The tone was conciliatory, but Lillian wasn't fooled. After months of fighting, after all the resistance, the company was finally coming to the table. The letter read, "We acknowledge the growing concerns raised by the workers and the public. We understand that change is necessary, and we are committed to engaging in dialogue with Stand Together to find a solution that addresses the needs of our employees while ensuring the continued success of the business." Lillian stared at the letter, the weight of it settling in. It was a significant step, but she knew they couldn't let their guard down. This was just one company. This was just the beginning. And the fight for workers' rights wasn't about negotiating better terms for a select few. It was about changing the entire system. But for the first time in months, Lillian allowed herself a moment of relief. The movement was working. They had made Rising Star listen, and they were forcing change in ways that had once seemed impossible. "This is it," Lillian whispered to herself. "We've turned the tide." But she wasn't naive enough to believe the battle was over. There was still a long road ahead, and countless corporations to hold accountable. She had known from the beginning that this wouldn't be easy, but she also knew one thing with certainty. They had the power to change the world. And with the workers by her side, there was nothing she couldn't accomplish. The next chapter had begun, and Stand Together was leading the charge. The news of Rising Star's decision to engage in dialogue with Stand Together sent shockwaves through both the corporate world and the movement. It was a rare, hard-won victory, but Lillian knew it wasn't the end. It was a door opening to what could be a new era, not just for Stand Together, but for workers across the country. Still, there was something that gnawed at her, a feeling that the movement was becoming bigger than anyone could control. Lillian knew that the more attention they received, the more they were at risk of losing sight of the cause. They had to remain grounded, focused. They couldn't let the power they had gained go to their heads. But as the negotiations with Rising Star progressed and the momentum built, something unexpected happened. An ally emerged. And not just any ally. Someone who, for all intents and purposes, seemed an unlikely partner in this fight. It was Sarah Thompson, the notoriously tough CEO of Toscana Foods, another major restaurant chain. Lillian had never met Sarah, but she'd heard of her. Toscana Foods was known for its upscale dining experience, and Sarah had always been seen as the epitome of corporate power. She'd built Toscana into a global brand, a juggernaut in the food industry. From the outside, she seemed like everything Lillian was fighting against. A CEO who was far removed from the struggles of everyday workers. But then, a surprising thing happened. Sarah reached out to Lillian. At first, Lillian was skeptical. Could this really be genuine? A CEO of a massive corporation, known for her iron fist in the industry, suddenly wanting to partner with a grassroots movement that aimed to dismantle the very structure she had benefited from? She agreed to meet Sarah, but kept her guard up. The meeting took place in a sleek, high-rise boardroom overlooking the city. Sarah was already there when Lillian arrived, standing near the windows, her arms crossed as she gazed out at the skyline. She looked like someone who had spent years on top of the world and wasn't going to come down anytime soon. "Lillian, thank you for meeting with me," Sarah said, extending her hand. Lillian took a seat across from her, narrowing her eyes slightly. "What's this about, Sarah? Why now? Why Stand Together?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes steely but not without a hint of something else. Remorse? Lillian wasn't sure. "I'll be honest with you," Sarah began, her voice calm. "Toscana has been getting a lot of bad press lately. We've been accused of paying our workers poorly, of not doing enough to address issues of diversity, of ignoring the voices of those who keep this company running. And I'll admit, a lot of it is true. We've fallen short in a lot of areas. The problem is, the restaurant industry as a whole has built its business on exploiting people. And the truth is, I don't think we can continue on this path. Lillian blinked, taken aback by the directness of Sarah's words. This wasn't the corporate spiel she had expected. There was no talk of brand protection or the usual empty promises. Instead, Sarah was owning up to the problem. So what does that mean? Lillian asked, her voice guarded. You're just going to turn around and support Stand Together? Sarah nodded. I've spent the last few months listening to the stories of workers, seeing what's happening with Rising Star, and how Stand Together has really forced the issue into the public's eye. And I'll be honest, it's been an eye-opener. I've always been good at what I do, building brands, driving profits, but I've ignored the fact that real people are getting hurt along the way. I don't want to be part of a system that dehumanizes workers. Lillian's skepticism was still there, but now, something else was rising inside her, the spark of possibility. Could this really be happening? Could Sarah Thompson be for real? You're saying you want to partner with us? Lillian asked, trying to keep her tone even. Sarah's expression softened. I don't expect a hero's welcome, but I know that we can't make real change alone. Toscana is willing to change its practices, pay better, treat workers with dignity, and become more transparent. But I want Stand Together to help guide us through the process. I want you to help us change, Lillian. From the inside. Lillian sat back in her chair, considering the offer. This was a massive company with an enormous reach. If they could truly enact the kind of changes they were talking about, it could set a precedent for the entire industry. But there was still a part of her that couldn't quite trust Sarah. Too many corporate leaders had made empty promises in the past. Too many times had the workers been forgotten once the cameras stopped rolling. How do I know this isn't just another PR stunt? Lillian asked, her voice firm. Sarah met her gaze, unwavering. You don't, but I'm willing to be held accountable. I'm offering you transparency, a seat at the table, and a chance to create real change. If we fail, you'll be the first to know. But I want to try. For the workers. For the industry. Lillian sat in silence, weighing the options. She had spent so much of her life fighting against the corporate machine, working from the outside in, leading a revolution that had to bulldoze its way through every wall. Could she afford to take a chance on a CEO who seemed to genuinely want change? And if she did, could it work? I need time to think about it, Lillian said finally. This isn't just about Toscana. It's about the whole industry. If we do this, we do it right. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a CEO accustomed to getting her way. It was the smile of someone who knew the road ahead would be difficult, but was willing to walk it anyway. I understand. Take your time. But know this, I'm ready to act. And I'm not backing down. As Lillian left the meeting, her mind was spinning. This was the kind of move she had always dreamed of, corporate power aligning with workers' rights. It could be the game changer the movement needed, but it came with its own set of risks. But one thing was clear. Stand Together had now become more than just a movement. It was a force that could reshape the entire industry. And this new, unexpected ally might just be the key to making that happen. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Lillian felt a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Lillian's mind raced after her meeting with Sarah Thompson. She had always prided herself on being able to read people, to know when someone was genuine and when they were simply playing a part. Sarah, in her own way, had shown a level of vulnerability that surprised Lillian. But Lillian also knew that vulnerability in the corporate world often came with hidden agendas. She had learned the hard way that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and corporate leaders didn't usually walk away from power without a fight. Still, Sarah's offer lingered in her mind. Toscana Foods was a major player, and if they genuinely wanted to change, it could mean real progress. But if they were simply trying to use Stand Together as a smokescreen to salvage their public image, it would destroy everything they had worked for. Lillian had a lot of thinking to do, and time was not on her side. The pressure from both Rising Star's lawsuit and the increasingly volatile public backlash against the restaurant industry was mounting. Meanwhile, Stand Together was growing, gaining momentum with every new story of workers speaking out and joining the cause. The movement had taken on a life of its own, and Lillian wasn't sure if it could ever be fully controlled again. That reality, though, was also its strength. That night, as Lillian sat at her desk, scrolling through messages of support, she received a text from Emily. Sarah called me. It read, "She wants to meet with you again soon. She says there's more she needs to discuss." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. What else could she possibly have to say? She quickly typed a response. Set it up. I'm in. The next day, they met at Toscana Foods headquarters, an imposing structure that towered above the city. The building itself felt like a symbol of everything Lillian had been fighting against. Cold, efficient, and rooted in the old ways of doing business. When Lillian entered the conference room, Sarah was already there, waiting for her. She stood up as Lillian walked in, offering a smile that seemed a bit more strained than before. "I appreciate you coming back," Sarah said, motioning for Lillian to sit. "I know you're busy, and this is a big ask." Lillian remained silent, choosing instead to take a seat across from Sarah. She was done with pleasantries. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "You said you wanted to talk more about what Toscana is willing to do for workers," Lillian said. "But before we go any further, let's be clear. I'm not here to play games. If you want to change the industry, you need to show me something more than just words." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "I understand, and I'm ready to show you more." She paused before continuing, clearly choosing her words carefully. "We've been looking into the ways Toscana can make a real impact, not just within our own company, but in the industry at large," she said. "We want to make sure our workers are paid fairly, given access to benefits, and treated with the respect they deserve. But it's not just about that. We're also looking at ways to change the broader culture of the restaurant industry. We know that it's not just Toscana that's guilty. The entire system is built on exploitation, and if we really want to change it, we have to be willing to lead by example." Lillian leaned forward, her skepticism still firmly in place. "And what exactly does that mean for Stand Together?" Sarah's eyes locked with hers. "It means we're ready to work with you, not just in a public relations sense, but in a real, meaningful way. We want to fund initiatives that will help workers in other restaurants get better pay, health insurance, and the support they need to speak out against injustice. We want to be the first major company to commit to making these changes across the board." Lillian remained silent for a moment, absorbing Sarah's words. It was a lot to take in, and she still wasn't sure if she believed it. Corporate speak was one thing, but real action was another. She had seen companies try to co-opt movements before, use their cause to boost their image, only to pull back the moment the spotlight shifted. "I don't know if I can trust you," Lillian finally said. "The restaurant industry has a long history of promises that never materialize. Words are easy. I need more than that." "I know," Sarah said, her voice steady. "And I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, but I want to prove that we can make change. I'm willing to be transparent, to let you and your team help guide us through the process. I'm even willing to allow external audits of Toscana's operations to ensure that we're doing the right thing." Lillian's eyes narrowed. Audits? That was a big step for a company like Toscana. But something about Sarah's tone made it clear that this wasn't just a show for the media. Sarah wasn't asking for approval. She was asking for help. "Why?" Lillian asked. "Why now?" Sarah sighed, the weight of everything seemingly settling on her shoulders. "Because I've seen enough. I've been in this business long enough to know that if we don't change, we're going to keep losing. I see what's happening with Rising Star, and I can't ignore it anymore. I've built my career on running a profitable company, but I can't ignore the fact that profits have come at the expense of workers. It's unsustainable, and frankly, it's starting to feel wrong." Lillian sat back, stunned. She had expected more corporate doublespeak, more deflection. But Sarah was laying it all on the line, admitting the very things Lillian had spent her life fighting against. "I'm asking you, Lillian, to help me lead this change, to help us become the example of what's possible when a company is willing to do the right thing. And I'm asking for Stand Together to hold us accountable every step of the way." Lillian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Could she trust Sarah? Was this a genuine opportunity for change, or was it another attempt to neutralize the movement and regain control of the narrative? "I'll need time to think about it," Lillian said, her voice calm but firm. "But know this, if we're going to do this, it's not just about making a few changes. This has to be a complete transformation. I'm not going to let Toscana or anyone else use this movement for their own gain. Sarah nodded, a glint of respect in her eyes. Understood. I won't try to rush you, but know that I'm serious about this. We're ready to do whatever it takes. As Lillian left Toscana Foods headquarters that day, she felt the weight of the decision ahead of her. She knew the risks, and she knew that if she chose to work with Sarah, they would be walking a fine line. The road ahead would be dangerous, and there were no guarantees of success. But if there was even a chance that this could be the beginning of real change for workers, it was a chance she couldn't ignore. And so, the question remained. Was Sarah Thompson an ally, or just another corporate player trying to save her brand? The answer would come in time, but Lillian wasn't about to make that decision alone. She needed to consult with her team, her allies, and the workers who had made Stand Together what it was. Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain. The movement was no longer just a protest. It had become a powerful force, and it was starting to change the game. The days following her meeting with Sarah Thompson were tense. Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Her team at Stand Together had been working tirelessly to expose the flaws in the restaurant industry, and they had gained so much ground in the fight for workers' rights. But Sarah's offer, genuine or not, had the potential to shift everything. Lillian knew one thing for certain. They couldn't afford to make the wrong decision. She spent the next few days meeting with Emily, Marcus, and some of the key organizers within Stand Together, trying to figure out what this partnership with Toscana Foods would mean for their mission. They couldn't deny that the resources and power of a company like Toscana could do incredible things for the movement. But there was always the looming question. Was Sarah truly committed to change, or was this just another corporate play to clean up a tarnished reputation? We need to think about the workers, Emily said one afternoon as they sat around the table in their small office. This isn't just about us, it's about them. If we partner with Toscana, we need to make sure that we have their backs. We can't let them use us as a stepping stone to rebrand themselves while leaving the workers behind. Lillian nodded. Emily was right. This couldn't be just about appearances. It had to be about making lasting, tangible change for the workers, for the industry. We'll need to be smart about this, Lillian replied. We can't just walk in blindly. We need full transparency, real commitments, and no more half measures. If Sarah's serious about this, she's going to have to prove it every step of the way. Marcus, always the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. And if she's not serious? If this is just another corporate stunt? Lillian looked out the window, lost in thought for a moment. Then we walk away. No compromises. But as the conversation continued, doubt began to creep into Lillian's mind. What if they did miss an opportunity? What if Toscana was genuinely ready to change the entire system, but only if Stand Together led the charge? Could she afford to turn that down, knowing how much could be at stake? The decision was weighing on her, and the clock was ticking. The following week, they met again with Sarah. This time, it wasn't just Lillian. Emily and Marcus were there as well, and they came prepared. They had a list of demands, expectations, and terms they were not willing to budge on. No more vague promises. They needed concrete action. Sarah greeted them warmly but was clearly on edge. She knew the stakes had just gotten higher, but there was no going back. If Stand Together wasn't on board, her plans for a company-wide transformation would fall apart. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah said as she motioned for them to sit around the conference table. "I know this isn't easy, but I want to get to the heart of what you need, what Toscana can offer, and what we need to do to move forward." Lillian cut straight to the chase. "We're not here for lip service, Sarah. We need specifics. Toscana needs to show us exactly what you're willing to do to help workers and change the entire industry." Sarah's expression was serious. "I'm ready to put everything on the table. We'll start by providing workers with fair wages, including minimum wage increases across all levels. We're also ready to roll out a comprehensive benefits package, offering health insurance, paid sick leave, and mental health support. And we'll set up a program to allow workers to get involved in the decision-making process, because it's their voices that matter." It was a strong start, but Lillian wasn't about to let Sarah off that easily. She pressed on. "Those are great, but what about accountability? If Toscana is serious, there needs to be independent oversight to ensure you're meeting these promises. How do we know you won't just make some changes on paper and then go back to business as usual?" Sarah didn't hesitate. We're open to external audits. We'll have independent parties come in every quarter to ensure that we're meeting our goals. And we'll publish the results so everyone knows exactly where we stand. Lillian nodded, but remained cautious. This was a step in the right direction, but it still didn't feel like enough. They needed to go further. Toscana had the power to make this movement explode into something bigger than they had ever imagined, but it had to be done right. I'll be honest, Sarah, Emily interjected. You're saying all the right things, but you need to show us more. Toscana isn't just any company. You're a global leader. Your influence is immense. So if you really want to lead by example, we need you to push the entire industry toward change. We need you to use your platform, your power, to call out the other major players in this industry and force them to do the same. Sarah leaned back in her chair, clearly thinking. It was a challenge, and Lillian could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to pick fights with her competitors, not without knowing if it would pay off. I'll commit to a public statement, Sarah said slowly. We'll publicly call on the entire industry to follow suit, and we'll use Toscana's resources to ensure that workers everywhere are treated better. But it's going to be a battle. You know that. Lillian exchanged a look with Emily and Marcus. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. If Sarah was willing to take the fight public, it would send a message that could shift the entire power structure in the industry. We'll need to keep the pressure on, Lillian said, her voice firm. No turning back now. We'll hold Toscana accountable, and if you fail, the entire world will know it. We can't let this be a PR stunt. It's all or nothing. Sarah nodded, her face set. I'm ready. Let's do it. But just as Lillian was about to respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the message. It was from a reporter she had been working with closely. Lillian, I just got some intel. There's a massive shakeup happening at Rising Star right now. They've been forced to release internal memos showing that they've been underreporting wages and misclassifying employees to avoid paying overtime. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. This was big, huge. It was the kind of smoking gun they had been waiting for, and it could shift the tide in their favor once and for all. Sarah, Lillian said, her voice sharp, we've got a bigger fight ahead of us. Rising Star just got exposed. We need to go public with this immediately. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Sarah's eyes narrowed, but her resolve never wavered. Then let's take it to them. The game was changing, and Lillian knew that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, but they were finally in the position to win it. The hours after receiving the explosive information about Rising Star were a blur of frantic phone calls, emails, and strategy sessions. Lillian knew this was a turning point, an opportunity to strike a blow against one of the most powerful, corrupt companies in the restaurant industry. But with the stakes so high, she also understood that everything they had worked for could unravel if they weren't careful. She sat at the head of the table, surrounded by Emily, Marcus, and the core group of stand-together organizers, all of them glued to their phones, eyes flicking from screen to screen. The room buzzed with urgency, the energy charged with anticipation. It wasn't just about one company anymore. It was about changing the entire system. The memos are damning, Emily said, tapping her phone. They've been underreporting wages, misclassifying employees as independent contractors to avoid paying benefits, and manipulating overtime numbers. This is everything we need to expose them. Lillian leaned forward, her fingers pressing against her temples. The Rising Star scandal could be the game-changer they'd been waiting for. But they had to be smart. They couldn't just drop the information without a plan. The media, the public, and even the workers needed to see that this was part of a larger fight for fairness, not just a targeted attack on one company. What's the best angle? Marcus asked, his tone sharp as ever. How do we make this stick? Lillian thought for a moment before answering. We need to tie Rising Star's practices to the systemic issues within the entire industry. This isn't just about one company being corrupt. It's about a culture that exploits workers, pushes them to the brink, and expects them to stay quiet. Rising Star may have been the catalyst, but we're going to make sure the world understands that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Emily nodded. We need to mobilize workers, too. If we can get them to speak out, the ones who have been silenced by fear, by threats, that's what will make people listen. They need to see the human cost behind the headlines. Lillian's gaze shifted toward the window, her mind racing. There was something she had to address before they could go public with the Rising Star scandal. Sarah Thompson and Toscana Foods were still very much a part of the equation. If they moved forward with this fight and everything went public, the last thing she wanted was for the Toscana partnership to be seen as opportunistic. She needed to speak with Sarah first. "We can't afford any distractions," Lillian said, her voice resolute. "I need to talk to Sarah. We have to make sure that whatever we do with Toscana aligns with what's happening with Rising Star. If we're going to take them down, we need to keep our message tight. No room for confusion." Emily looked concerned. "Are you sure about this? After everything that's been said, I'd be careful. We don't know if Toscana is fully on our side yet." Lillian hesitated, but knew Emily was right. The deal with Toscana was still fragile. One wrong move, and it could collapse. But if they played their cards right, Toscana could be a powerful ally, a company with enough clout to force real change. "I'll be careful," Lillian assured her. "But we need all the help we can get. If Sarah is serious, she'll back us up. If not, we walk." With that, Lillian called Sarah to arrange a meeting for later that afternoon. She couldn't afford to wait much longer. When they met at Toscana Foods' sleek, modern headquarters, Lillian was met with the same calm professionalism Sarah had shown during their last meeting. But there was something different in Sarah's eyes, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. "You wanted to talk?" Sarah asked, gesturing for Lillian to sit. "I don't want to waste your time," Lillian said, getting straight to the point. "We're about to go public with some information about Rising Star. It's a big scandal, and it could be the breaking point for this entire industry. But I need to make sure you're fully committed. We're going to need more than just words if this is going to work. Are you with us?" Sarah's gaze hardened, and Lillian could see her processing the weight of the situation. "This is bigger than I thought. If you're moving forward with this, then Toscana will be all in. You have my word." Lillian studied Sarah's face, searching for any sign of hesitation. Is she telling the truth? It was hard to say, but there was something in Sarah's tone that made Lillian think she might actually be ready to walk the talk. "I need you to take a stand," Lillian continued. "Publicly. We can't just be seen as a group of activists. If Toscana wants to help, we need them to be in the trenches with us, not on the sidelines. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah's answer was firm. "Yes, I'll do it. I'll back you up." Lillian took a deep breath. She didn't have time to waste on second-guessing. "Then let's do it." That evening, Stand Together launched their latest initiative, and it wasn't just a press release. They had all the evidence needed to expose Rising Star's practices, and they were ready to unleash it to the world. They organized a massive online campaign, flooding social media with infographics, personal stories from workers who had been impacted, and breaking news that tied Rising Star's wage manipulation to the larger systemic issue of exploitation in the restaurant industry. They used the hashtag #RiseUpAgainstExploitation, and it quickly went viral. The team also started reaching out to former Rising Star employees who had been part of the company's misclassified worker scheme. Workers who had been silent for years were now coming forward, sharing their stories. The fear of retaliation was no longer enough to keep them quiet. Lillian and her team knew this would be the key to galvanizing public support. Meanwhile, Sarah was true to her word. She tweeted her support for the movement, calling for transparency and accountability from all restaurant chains. Her statement read, "The time has come to lead by example. Workers deserve fair pay, fair treatment, and the opportunity to speak out without fear of reprisal. Toscana Foods will be part of the solution, not part of the problem." The next few days were a whirlwind. Rising Star tried to defend itself in the press, but the evidence was too damning. The story was everywhere, and the pressure was mounting on them to respond. For the first time in years, the tide was turning. But as Lillian watched the unfolding media storm, a deep sense of unease lingered. They had made their move, but with every victory came a new danger. She had to be prepared for whatever came next. As the workers continued to speak out and the public began to demand change, Lillian couldn't help but wonder. Was this the beginning of the end for the corrupt practices that had plagued the restaurant industry for so long? Or was it just the start of a much larger battle? The stakes were higher than ever, and Lillian knew they were playing for everything. It was now or never. The storm that followed the exposure of Rising Star was unlike anything Lillian had ever experienced. The media coverage was relentless, with news outlets across the country picking up the story. Social media exploded with the hashtag Rise Up Against Exploitation, trending for days, and workers from every corner of the restaurant industry began sharing their stories. The truth was out, and the world was listening. But with all the attention came a surge of opposition, not from the usual suspects, but from unexpected corners. Support for Stand Together and its mission was growing, but so were the forces that sought to undermine them. Lillian sat in her office late one night, the glow of her laptop screen casting a pale light over the cluttered desk. She skimmed through the latest round of messages flooding in from all sides. There were letters of support, certainly, but there were also threats, veiled and direct, warning her to back down. Some came from Rising Star's legal team, others from anonymous sources tied to the restaurant industry's most powerful players. A soft knock on the door broke her concentration. "Lillian?" Emily's voice was muffled but clear from the hallway. "Can we talk?" "Come in," Lillian called, pushing her laptop away and leaning back in her chair. Emily stepped in, holding a stack of papers in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She set the coffee down on the desk, giving Lillian a concerned look. "I don't know how to say this, but things are escalating faster than we thought," Emily said, her tone uneasy. "I've been going through some of the legal threats, and they're getting serious. Rising Star isn't backing down. In fact, they're launching a counter-campaign, calling us radical extremists who are out to destroy an entire industry." Lillian sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew the backlash was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. The restaurant industry had deep pockets, and they would stop at nothing to protect their power. But this time, it was different. This time, they were up against something bigger than they anticipated. "I expected it," Lillian replied, her voice steady but weary. "We're threatening their bottom line, Emily. Of course they'll come after us, but we can't let that stop us. We're on the right side of this, and we're not backing down." Emily nodded, but there was a trace of doubt in her eyes. "It's not just the legal threats. There's something bigger going on. I've heard rumors that Rising Star is trying to pull some strings behind the scenes, using their influence to get local governments to shut us down, or at least slow us down. They're pressuring the media to discredit us, too." Lillian sat up straighter, her instincts kicking in. This was exactly what they had been warned about. The people they were up against weren't just big corporations. They were deep, powerful networks, pulling strings from behind closed doors. And they weren't afraid to get dirty. "They'll try," Lillian said, her voice firm, "but we've been prepared for this. We knew this wasn't going to be easy. We have the truth on our side. And we have the workers. They won't be silenced anymore." Emily hesitated, then placed the stack of papers in front of Lillian. "I don't want to say this, but I think you need to see these." Lillian flipped through the papers. It was a dossier of sorts, containing screenshots of private messages, emails, and documents that were somehow connected to the larger fight. There were conversations from inside Rising Star, discussing how they were planning to respond to the scandal. And it wasn't just about denying the allegations. They were organizing a smear campaign, working with a network of high-profile PR firms and media personalities to discredit Lillian and her team. The worst part? The documents showed a disturbing pattern of manipulation, not just of the press, but of their own employees. Rising Star had been paying off workers to stay silent, promising bonuses or even job security in exchange for their cooperation in keeping quiet about the mistreatment. And worse still, they had a list of workers who had agreed to participate in the smear campaign against Stand Together, offering statements that claimed the movement was radical and out of touch with reality. Lillian's heart raced as she read through the files. The magnitude of what they were up against was becoming clearer by the minute. Rising Star wasn't just protecting their bottom line. They were willing to do anything, including sacrificing their own employees, to maintain the status quo. "We need to get this information out," Lillian said, her voice low but determined. "These documents can't stay hidden. We have to expose them." Emily agreed. "The workers need to know what Rising Star is doing. We can't let them control the narrative. We'll release these documents through our network and let the public see exactly what they've been up to." But as the team began to mobilize, preparing the next wave of information for release, a knock at the door interrupted them again. This time, it was Marcus, his face tense and serious. "We have a problem," Marcus said, his voice grave. "It's about Sarah Thompson." Lillian frowned, confused. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "Her company, Toscana Foods, is under fire now," Marcus continued. "I just got word from an inside source. Toscana has been linked to a major labor violation at one of their warehouses. There are claims that they've been using the same tactics Rising Star was using: misclassifying workers, underreporting hours, and keeping workers in dangerous conditions." Lillian's stomach dropped. Toscana had been their ally, the company that had promised to stand alongside them in the fight for change. But if this information was true, everything they had worked for could collapse in an instant. "We need to verify this," Lillian said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But if it's true, if Sarah Thompson is involved in this, we can't afford to stand by her. This fight is bigger than any one person or company. We have to stay true to our mission." Emily's face was pale as she nodded. "We're not backing down, but this could ruin everything." Lillian took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew the battle was far from over. In fact, it had just gotten more complicated. They were no longer fighting just Rising Star. Now, they had to face the possibility that even their allies might be compromised. But as always, Lillian had one goal in mind: the workers. She couldn't afford to let anything distract her from that. The truth was out, and it was more powerful than any company's wealth or influence. They were on the brink of something massive. Now, it was time to see who would stand with them and who would fall. The days following the revelation about Toscana Foods were a whirlwind of uncertainty. The phone calls, the emails, the text messages, they kept coming, each one more urgent than the last. Lillian didn't know who to trust anymore. Even the allies she thought she could rely on were beginning to crack under pressure. But she couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Not when they were so close. She sat at her desk, eyes scanning the latest reports about Toscana Foods and their labor violations. The allegations were serious. Workers had come forward claiming that Toscana had knowingly misclassified employees, forcing them to work under unsafe conditions and depriving them of their rightful wages. And to make matters worse, there were whispers that Sarah Thompson herself had been complicit in covering it up. Lillian didn't want to believe it. She had seen something in Sarah that made her think the CEO of Toscana Foods was on their side. But the evidence was starting to pile up, and it didn't look good. "Are we sure this is real?" Emily asked, standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of worry and disbelief. She had been working around the clock to dig into the claims, but she hadn't been able to verify everything yet. "I don't know," Lillian replied, her voice strained, "but it's looking worse by the minute. We can't ignore it. If Sarah is involved in this, we need to distance ourselves from Toscana, no matter how much it hurts." Emily shook her head. What if she's just unaware? What if someone within the company is doing this behind her back? "It's possible," Lillian admitted. "But if she was truly on our side, she would have caught this by now. She's the CEO. She's the one who should be ensuring that Toscana upholds the values we're fighting for." There was a long pause, the weight of the situation sinking in. Emily finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Do you think this is why she's been so quiet lately? I haven't heard much from her since the campaign started." Lillian frowned. She hadn't thought about it that way, but it made sense. Sarah's silence could be a sign that she was trying to protect herself, or worse, that she knew about the violations and was trying to cover them up. "We need to confront her," Lillian said, determination hardening her voice. "We can't keep speculating. We need answers, and we need them now." Emily nodded, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. "Are you sure you're ready for that? What if she's not the ally we thought she was?" Lillian took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy, but she had come this far, and she couldn't afford to let anything, or anyone, stand in the way of the movement they had built. If Sarah wasn't part of the solution, she would have to be part of the problem. And Lillian wasn't about to back down. "I'm ready," Lillian said. "We have to meet her face to face. We can't let this go on any longer." Later that afternoon, Lillian and Emily found themselves sitting in the sleek conference room at Toscana Foods headquarters. The walls were adorned with framed images of pristine, gleaming food displays, the kind that made Toscana look like an industry leader, a company that valued quality, innovation, and fairness. But as Lillian stared at those pictures, all she saw was the glaring contradiction between the image Toscana presented to the world and the reality of what was happening behind closed doors. Sarah Thompson entered the room, her presence commanding as always. She looked exactly the same, confident, poised, and impeccably dressed. But there was something in her eyes that Lillian hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. "Lillian, Emily," Sarah said, her voice smooth but tight. "I didn't expect you both to come by so soon. What's going on?" Lillian didn't waste any time. She went straight to the point. "We know about the allegations, Sarah," she said, her tone firm but not accusatory. "About Toscana Foods and the labor violations. We have the evidence. Workers have come forward, and the claims are serious. Misclassification, unsafe working conditions, wage theft. It's all there." Sarah's face didn't change, but Lillian could see the flicker of panic in her eyes. She folded her arms across her chest, as if to protect herself from the weight of the accusations. I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. "I've worked hard to ensure that Toscana follows all labor laws. I would never knowingly allow anything like that to happen under my watch." Lillian wasn't convinced. "You're the CEO, Sarah. You're the one responsible for everything that happens at Toscana. And if you didn't know about it, then you should have. This is your company." Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, her deflection faltering. "I'll look into it. I'll launch an internal investigation. But I swear to you, Lillian, I didn't know." Emily glanced at Lillian, her expression skeptical. "That's what you said when we first spoke, remember? You promised that Toscana would support us, that you were committed to the workers. But now, we're hearing these stories that paint you and your company in a very different light." Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then, she spoke again, her voice quieter. "I don't know how this happened. If I'd known, I would have fixed it. But now it's a mess, and I don't know how to make it right." Lillian took a deep breath, her frustration growing. This is it. This is the moment. She had to make a decision. She couldn't afford to keep second-guessing. The truth had to come first. "If you really want to make things right, Sarah," Lillian said, her voice cold, "then you'll do more than just launch an investigation. You'll stand with us. You'll speak out, publicly, and take full responsibility for the failures within your company. And you'll make sure that the workers who've been wronged are compensated, that they're treated fairly. If you're not willing to do that, then we're done here. We can't afford to be seen with a company that profits off the backs of exploited workers." Sarah's face fell, and for the first time, she looked defeated. But there was a flicker of something else, a realization that Lillian wasn't bluffing. "I'll do it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take the responsibility. I'll speak out. I'll fix this." Lillian held her gaze for a moment, searching for sincerity. Then, she nodded. "Good," she said, standing up. "I hope you mean it." As Lillian and Emily left Toscana Foods headquarters, a heavy silence hung between them. The conversation had gone exactly as expected, but now came the hard part, trusting that Sarah would follow through. Lillian knew this was a turning point. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and they couldn't afford to falter. The battle was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about staying true to their mission, no matter the cost. They were on the edge of something massive, but the real question was, could they make it through the storm intact? And, more importantly, could they bring real change to an industry that had long been built on exploitation? The fight was far from over, but Lillian was ready for whatever came next. The weeks after the confrontation with Sarah Thompson and Toscana Foods were a blur. The news about the CEO's commitment to reform and the ongoing investigation into labor violations was a step in the right direction, but Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. This was a pivotal moment, not just for Stand Together, but for the entire restaurant industry. It was more than just a battle over one company. It was a fight for systemic change. The media buzzed with updates, but Lillian knew that the real work was still ahead. Now, the challenge was to maintain the momentum they had built and turn the public's outrage into lasting reform. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about changing the system that allowed companies like Rising Star and Toscana Foods to thrive on the exploitation of workers. Lillian spent her days meeting with workers, listening to their stories, and strategizing with her team. There were protests to organize, statements to release, and public figures to rally to their cause. The movement had reached a tipping point. It was no longer a question of if change could happen, but whether they could maintain the strength to see it through. One afternoon, as Lillian sat in her office preparing a speech for an upcoming rally, she received a call that would change everything. "Lillian," Emily's voice came through the line, "urgent. You need to get down here. Now." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "It's Rising Star. They've just launched an attack. They're trying to discredit everything we've done. They've got footage, fake footage, making it look like we've been manipulating workers, and now they're calling us terrorists." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. She knew Rising Star wouldn't go down without a fight, but this was the kind of dirty tactic they had been preparing for. "Where are you?" she asked, already grabbing her coat. "I'm at the headquarters. I'll brief you when you get here, but we need to act fast. This could turn the tide against us if we don't fight back." Lillian hung up the phone and rushed out the door, her mind racing. This was it, the final showdown. They were up against an enemy that would stop at nothing to destroy them. But Lillian wasn't about to back down. She had fought too hard for this movement, for the workers who were depending on them. When Lillian arrived at the office, she found Emily pacing in front of the TV, her face pale as she watched the news report. The anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news. Stand Together, the worker rights organization that has been pushing for change in the restaurant industry, is now under investigation by federal authorities. Sources claim that the group has been using deceptive tactics to coerce workers into making false statements, and several high-profile leaders in the movement are reportedly linked to extremist organizations." The footage flashed on screen. Blurry shots of protests, chaotic moments from their rallies, and snippets of workers being interviewed. But there was something wrong about it. The voices were distorted, the footage selectively edited to make the movement look dangerous, manipulative, and radical. It was a coordinated attempt to paint them as terrorists. "This is an outright lie," Emily muttered, her voice shaking. "They're trying to frame us." Lillian didn't say anything at first, her mind processing the gravity of the situation. She had known this moment was coming, but seeing it unfold so quickly was a different reality altogether. Rising Star wasn't just fighting back. They were going for the jugular. They were trying to bury everything they had worked for, to destroy their credibility once and for all. But Lillian knew one thing. They had the truth on their side, and the truth would always find a way to come out. "We're not going to let them win," Lillian said, her voice steel. Emily nodded. "We'll need to go public with the footage we have. The real footage. The footage of us speaking with workers, of us organizing peaceful protests. We'll expose their lies for what they are." "We need to get ahead of this," Lillian replied. "I'll talk to the press. We'll hold a press conference tomorrow. We'll show them the truth." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Do you really think that's going to be enough? Rising Star is playing dirty, and we're up against powerful people. They'll try to bury us." Lillian looked at her, determination hardening in her eyes. "If we don't stand up now, we'll never get another chance. We've come this far because we've been fearless. We've done what's right, not what's easy. And that's exactly what we need to do now." The next morning, Lillian stood at the podium before a sea of cameras, reporters, and workers who had gathered in support of Stand Together. The weight of the situation was not lost on her. Rising Star had just launched the most vicious attack on their integrity, and now it was time to fight back. The press conference began with Lillian addressing the lies that had been spread. "Yesterday, Rising Star tried to paint us as criminals," she began, her voice unwavering. "They tried to convince you that we were manipulating workers and spreading dangerous propaganda. But I'm here to tell you, that's not who we are. That's not what Stand Together stands for." She motioned to the screen behind her, where real footage from their protests, interviews with workers, and meetings with advocates played, uncut and untouched. The truth stood out in stark contrast to the false footage that Rising Star had aired. The truth is, we are fighting for workers' rights. We are fighting for a system that treats people with dignity, that rewards hard work with fair wages, that gives people a chance to rise above the exploitation they've faced for so long. And Rising Star, Toscana Foods, and the entire restaurant industry that profits off of these workers will do everything they can to stop us. They will lie. They will cheat. They will manipulate the truth. But we will not back down. Lillian's words were powerful, and the room was silent, hanging on every sentence. She could feel the tide beginning to turn. The journalists, the workers, the public, they were listening, and they were ready to hear the truth. "Let me be clear," Lillian continued, her voice rising. "We will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated. The workers who have joined this movement are the backbone of this country's economy. They deserve better. And together, we will bring the change that is long overdue." As she finished her speech, there was a palpable shift in the room. The reporters began asking questions, but this time, the questions were different. They weren't trying to discredit her anymore. They wanted to know more. They wanted to hear about the workers, about the movement, about the systemic change that Stand Together was advocating for. And in that moment, Lillian knew they had one. They had taken their final stand, and the world was watching. As the press conference ended and the crowd dispersed, Lillian felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, she believed they could actually win. They could make a difference. And that was worth everything. The fight wasn't over, but it was just beginning.